Her hands were shaking when they signed her name on the paper. Not her hands, her father's hands. She was sitting 3 chairs away, close enough to see the pen move, close enough to hear the scratch of ink against the document, but no one had asked her to come closer. No one had asked her anything at all. Her name was Nora Calloway. She was 17 years old, and the room smelled like old wood and candle wax, and the man across the table from her father had eyes that did not blink often enough. She had noticed that about him the first time he came to their house, 6 weeks earlier. He blinked slowly, deliberately, like a person who had learned patience as a discipline rather than a natural trait. His name was Elder Graves. That was what everyone called him. Not Mr. Graves. Not William Graves, which was the name on the letter he had brought. Elder Graves, always. The way a title replaces a person until the person disappears behind it. Nora's father, Gerald Calloway, set the pen down. He did not look at his daughter. He looked at the table, then at his hands, then at Elder Graves. "It is done," Gerald said. Elder Graves nodded once. "She will be cared for. She will have purpose." Nora did not understand, in that moment, what had been decided. She understood parts of it. She knew that Elder Graves represented a community called the Circle of the Faithful, which was not a church in the traditional sense but gathered like one, on the edge of the county, in a large house with white walls and a garden that produced more food than the people inside it could eat. She had driven past it once with her mother, before her mother left. The garden had looked beautiful. She remembered thinking that. She had been 12. She had pointed at it through the car window and said that it looked peaceful, and her mother had said nothing, had just driven faster. She did not know, at 17, sitting in that room while her father exchanged papers and nodded at a man with slow blinking eyes, that peaceful and trapped can wear the same face for a very long time before you learn to tell them apart. Gerald Calloway was not a cruel man. That was the hardest part for Nora to hold in her mind, years later, when she tried to make sense of that day. He was not the kind of father who raised his voice or came home with rage in his chest. He was quiet. He was tired in the way that men who have failed at most of what they tried become tired. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, like a building whose foundation has been shifting for so long that the cracks in the walls have simply become part of the decor. He had lost the hardware business that his own father built. He had lost Nora's mother to a man named Dennis, who had money and a house with a pool, and who had not needed to sell anything or borrow anything to keep the lights on. Gerald had borrowed. Gerald had lost. And when Elder Graves appeared at the door one Tuesday evening, with a casserole and a calm voice, and an offer that Gerald Calloway could not refuse, Gerald had sat at the kitchen table and listened for a long time without interrupting. Nora had been upstairs. She had heard the low murmur of voices but not the words. She had assumed it was the deacon from the church down the road, who sometimes stopped by with food, because Gerald was known to be struggling. She had gone back to her homework. She had not imagined that the conversation downstairs was about her. It took Elder Graves 4 visits before Gerald signed. Nora would learn this later, from a woman inside the compound named Helen, who had been there 11 years and kept a private record of things she was not supposed to remember. Helen was 61, small and sharp-eyed, with the kind of face that looks like it has decided something and is not changing its mind. Helen told Nora, in the 2nd month, that Elder Graves always took 4 visits. He was methodical. He arrived the first time with food, the second time with scripture and calm logic, the third time with a list of what the family would receive in exchange, the fourth time with the papers. What Gerald Calloway received, a payment that cleared his outstanding debts, a letter of assurance from 2 local businessmen who were also members of the circle, vouching that Gerald would be given priority on future contracts, and a promise, spoken, not written, that Nora would be educated, housed, clothed, and given a role of meaning within the community. That she would be, in Elder Graves's exact words, elevated. Gerald had believed that. Or he had needed to believe it, which is sometimes the same thing, and sometimes the most dangerous version of it. Nora was told the morning after the signing. Her father sat her down at breakfast and spoke carefully, in the way he always spoke when he had already made a decision and needed it to sound like a conversation. He told her that he had arranged for her to join a community, that she would live there and learn there, and be given opportunities that he, in his current condition, could not give her at home. He told her it was a good place. He told her the people were kind. He said, kind twice, she noticed. People who have to say a word twice are usually trying to convince themselves alongside the person they are addressing. She did not argue. She had learned, growing up in Gerald Calloway's house, that argument was a thing that exhausted him and changed nothing. He had already signed, the papers existed, her name was already written on a document that she had not been permitted to read, and her father's handwriting was already dry on the line beside it. There was nothing to argue against, there was only the fact of it. She packed 2 bags. Her father helped her carry them to the car. Elder Graves arrived at 9 in the morning, in a clean white vehicle, with a young man driving, a man named Owen, who smiled easily, and spoke about the compound the way a travel agent speaks about a resort. All highlights, no complications. Owen was perhaps 25. He had the look of someone who had grown up inside the circle, and had never developed the habit of wondering what was outside it. He told Nora that she was going to love the garden. He said the kitchen made bread every morning, and the smell of it filled the whole east wing. He said she would make friends quickly, because everyone was welcoming. Behind them, a series of buildings connected by covered walkways spread across several acres. There was the main house, which held the common rooms and the elders' offices, and a large dining hall. There was the east wing, where Nora would sleep, in a room she would share with 2 other women. There was the west building, which was the workroom, where members of the circle produced goods, candles, jams, woven baskets, carved wood items, that were sold at markets in the county. There was the chapel, which was not called a chapel but a gathering room, and which had no religious symbols on its walls, only large painted words in dark colors. Words like order and purpose and devotion, and, at the front of the room, behind the place where Elder Graves stood when he spoke, a single large word that Nora read the first time she was brought inside, and did not forget: alignment. She was shown her room on the first afternoon. Her 2 roommates were there. One was named Caroline, who was 22, and had been at the compound for 3 years, and who moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who has learned exactly what is expected of them. Caroline smiled at Nora with genuine warmth, or what appeared to be genuine warmth, which at that point in Nora's life she did not know how to distinguish. The other was named Petra, who was 19, and who had been brought in 8 months before Nora, and who looked, when she thought no one was watching, like a person listening very hard, for a sound that was not quite reaching her. Nora set her bags on the empty bed by the window. The window looked out onto the garden. It was, as Owen had said, beautiful. Rows of vegetables in neat lines, herbs in clay pots along the south wall, a pear tree at the far end that was heavy with fruit. She stood at the window for a moment and tried to locate inside herself what she was feeling. It was not fear, exactly. It was something quieter than fear. It was the sensation of standing at the beginning of something very long and very uncertain, and having no map. She turned from the window. Caroline was asking her if she needed help unpacking. Petra was sitting on her own bed, braiding a piece of cord that she held between her fingers. Nora said yes, thank you, and began to open her first bag. That first evening, she was taken to the dining hall for dinner. It was a long room, with wooden tables and mismatched chairs, warm with light from overhead lamps, and loud with the sound of conversation. There were perhaps 60 people, men and women, children too, of various ages. The food was simple but good: roasted vegetables, thick soup, the bread Owen had mentioned, dark and heavy and still warm. Elder Graves sat at the head of the first table. He ate without speaking, but every few minutes he looked up from his plate and surveyed the room in a slow arc, and when his gaze passed over Nora, she had the feeling of being read, the way a book is read, quickly, completely, without being asked. After dinner, there was a gathering. Everyone moved from the dining hall to the gathering room, and Elder Graves stood at the front and spoke for 40 minutes. He spoke about purpose and community and the noise of the outside world, which he described as a storm that breaks people who are not standing on firm ground. He spoke carefully, without raising his voice, without dramatic pauses. He spoke the way a river moves, steadily, continuously, wearing at the edges of things. Nora sat between Caroline and a man named Philip who was perhaps 40, and who mouthed some of the words along with Elder Graves, the way a person mouths along to a song they have heard many times. She listened. She did not yet understand what she was listening to. She thought, watching the faces around her, calm, attentive, nodding, that perhaps she had misjudged, Perhaps this was simply a community of people who had found something that worked for them. She had grown up in a house that did not work, that had leaked and tilted, and eventually come apart, and perhaps the mistake was assuming that every alternative must have something wrong with it. She told herself this. She kept telling herself this. She would keep telling herself this for longer than she would later be comfortable admitting. After the gathering, she was walked back to the East Wing by Caroline, who talked quietly about the schedule. What time they rose, what the morning duties were, which hours were for work and which for study, when meals were, where she could go and when. It was a full day, Nora noticed. There were no hours that were simply unaccounted for. Everything had a place in the schedule. She asked Caroline, carefully, what happened if someone needed to call home, needed to contact family? Caroline paused, just briefly. A half-second pause that most people would not notice, but that Nora, who had grown up watching her father's face for signs of what was coming, noticed immediately. You will talk with Elder Graves about that, Caroline said. In the first weeks, it is encouraged to settle in fully before reaching outward. It helps the adjustment. Nora nodded. She did not push further. She noted the answer the way she noted the word on the gathering room wall. She filed it. She went to bed in the narrow bed by the window and stared at the ceiling and listened to Caroline's breathing and Petra's breathing and the sounds of the compound settling around her. And she thought about her father's hands on the pen and the way he had not looked at her, and she understood, for the first time and without words, that she was going to need to be very careful here. Not afraid, not destroyed, just careful. She fell asleep to the smell of pear wood and candle wax, and outside, the garden was very still, under a moon that did not ask permission to be there, and she was 17 years old, and none of the things she was about to learn had been given to her yet, and in a way, that was the last uncomplicated night she would have for a very long time. In the morning, the bread was exactly as good as Owen had promised. She ate it at the long table, with 60 people, and she kept her eyes open, and she did not smile more than was natural, and she did not speak more than was useful, and somewhere inside her, beneath the fear that was not quite fear, a part of her that had been quietly building itself since the night her mother drove away, a part made of attention and patience, and a will that refused to fully lie down, was already watching, already counting, already beginning to learn the shape of the cage she was in, because the only way out of a place like this, she understood without anyone telling her, was to understand it completely, before it understood you. She reached for a second piece of bread. She said good morning to the woman next to her, whose name was Frances. Frances smiled and said good morning back, and poured Nora a cup of tea without being asked, and Nora said thank you, and drank it, and kept watching. She thought about her mother that first morning, sitting at the long table with the tea Frances had poured, and the bread that was warm and good. Her mother had driven past this place at 60 miles an hour 6 years ago, and had not said a word about it, which in retrospect was a word of its own. Her mother had an instinct for wrongness that she had not always acted on, but had rarely mislabeled. Nora had inherited this, she thought, or had developed it. The line between inherited and developed was one she had never fully resolved, but the thing itself, the ability to feel when a room was wrong, when a smile was doing extra work, when a word meant two things and only one of them was being said out loud, this was something she trusted. She trusted it now. The dining hall felt wrong in a specific way that she was still cataloging. The wrongness was not crude, it was not loud, it was the wrongness of something very deliberately assembled to not feel wrong, and she had learned, in 17 years of a house that was falling apart, that things which are working very hard to appear stable are often the least stable things in the room. Frances asked her where she was from. She said the name of the town. Frances smiled and said she had been through it once on a trip years ago, and that the old railway station had been beautiful. Did it still stand? Nora said she thought it did. She was not certain. She had lived in the town all her life and had passed the railway station many times without examining it closely, the way you do not examine the things that have always been present. Frances said that was the trouble with beautiful things at home. You stopped seeing them. Nora thought this was probably true of other things as well. She ate the rest of her bread and drank the rest of her tea, and watched the room fill and empty as people finished breakfast and went to their morning duties. And she was new enough that she still saw all of it, the furniture and the faces, and the way the light came through the east windows, in long pale strips across the wooden floor, and she decided that she was going to work very hard to keep seeing it. She was not going to let it become invisible to her the way the railway station had become invisible. She was going to keep looking at it every day, as though she were seeing it for the first time, because the day it stopped feeling like something she had walked into from outside was the day it would start to own her. She did not know, yet, how difficult this promise would be to keep. She would find out. But she had made it on the first morning, before she knew what was coming, and that mattered. She set down her cup. She helped Frances carry the cups to the washing station without being asked. Frances thanked her and said that was kind. Nora said it was nothing, and she went to find Doris, who would tell her where to report for the morning. The day had begun. She was in it. She kept her eyes open. 3 weeks in, Nora still had not been allowed to make a phone call. She had asked twice. The first time, a woman named Doris, who managed the East Wing and wore a ring of keys at her hip, like a jailer who had been told to pretend she was a housekeeper, told her that Elder Graves reviewed all outside communication requests personally, and that he was in a period of deep work and would see her soon. The second time, Doris told her the same thing, in the same order, without any change in tone, the way a recording repeats itself when you press the same button twice. Nora stopped asking. She started paying attention instead. She had learned, in the first 3 weeks, which people at the compound talked freely, and which people measured every word. She had learned that the gathering room was the place where Elder Graves said the things he wanted everyone to hear, and that the corridor behind the workroom, near the storage shelves where the candles were boxed, was the place where people said things they did not want him to hear. She had learned that Helen, the 61-year-old woman with the sharp eyes who had told her about the 4 visits, came to the candle corridor every other afternoon, on the pretense of taking inventory. She had learned that Petra, her roommate, had a sister outside the compound whom she had not spoken to in 4 months, and that when Petra thought about this, which was often, she pressed her lips together and looked at whatever was in front of her very hard, as though if she stared at it long enough, the wanting would go away. She had also learned what she was expected to do, and she did it. This was important. Nora was not the kind of person who made herself a target by resisting openly. She understood that resistance, here, had to be invisible. It had to live entirely inside her, with no evidence on the surface. So she rose at 5:30 with the others. She attended the morning study session, which ran for 90 minutes, and consisted of Elder Graves's written teachings, which were printed in a small booklet that each member carried. She worked her 4-hour shift in the workroom. She had been assigned to candle making, which was repetitive but not unpleasant, and which she used as time to observe the people around her. She ate her meals at the long table. She went to the evening gathering. She did all of it without complaint, without visible confusion, with a face that she had trained to show only what was useful to show. Inside, she was cataloging everything. The teachings were the first thing she examined carefully. Elder Graves's booklet was 47 pages, and it had the look of something that had been revised many times. Some passages were clear and simply worded, while others had the overly smooth quality of text that has been polished until all the rough edges that might allow a person to grip it are gone. The booklet taught that the outside world was not evil, but was disordered. It drew a picture of society as a place where people stumbled through their lives without direction, where loneliness was epidemic, where the relentless noise of modern life had severed the human connection to something the booklet called deep order, which was described as a natural state of harmony that existed when people lived in right relationship with one another and with their own purpose. This was not entirely wrong, Nora noticed. That was the clever part. The booklet was not filled with statements that were obviously false. It was filled with statements that were mostly true, and then with conclusions that did not necessarily follow from those truths, and then with instructions that did not necessarily follow from those conclusions. A person reading it carefully could see the seams, but the booklet was not meant to be read carefully. It was meant to be read in groups, aloud, with Elder Graves's voice, shaping the pauses and the emphasis, and in that context, the seams disappeared. She watched how the readings worked in practice. During morning study, a member was always called upon to read a passage aloud, and then Elder Graves, or in his absence one of the 4 senior members who were called the hands, would speak to the passage, interpreting it, adding context, connecting it to recent events in the compound. The connections were always made from the top down. Elder Graves's interpretation of a passage was the final interpretation. There was no discussion in the true sense. There were questions, sometimes. But the questions were always answered, never turned back, never allowed to open into real examination. Nora had seen, in the third week, a young man named Gordon raise his hand and ask whether the concept of deep order might be understood in more than one way. Elder Graves had smiled at Gordon in the way that adults smile at children who have said something almost right, but not quite, and he had said, "That is a question that shows you are thinking, Gordon, and thinking is good. But let us be careful not to confuse complexity with uncertainty. The teaching is clear. We must trust the clarity." Gordon had nodded. He had not asked another question. Nora had watched this and had felt something shift inside her. Not panic, not yet. Something more like the feeling of seeing the architecture of a building from above, suddenly understanding what it was actually designed to do, as opposed to what it appeared to do when you were standing inside it. The second thing she examined was the structure of relationships inside the compound. It was not flat. Despite the language of family and equality that the booklet used frequently, the reality was a clear hierarchy, with Elder Graves at the top, then the four hands, then the senior members who had been there longest, then the general membership, and then, at the very bottom, the newest arrivals. New arrivals were called the entering, which was a word that made arrival sound like a process rather than a state, which was accurate. It was a process, a careful, managed process of integration that was designed to feel like welcome, but functioned like examination. Nora was in the entering. She knew it. She was being watched, she understood, not with hostility, but with the quiet evaluation of people determining what a new piece could do and where it might fit. She had been assessed in small ways, given small responsibilities and observed to see how she handled them, asked casual questions by different members at different times that she recognized, in retrospect, as information gathering. She answered all of them pleasantly, and gave only what was true but not more than was necessary. She smiled where smiling was expected. She worked harder than was required. She made herself useful without making herself conspicuous. Helen found her in the candle corridor on a Wednesday afternoon, 3.5 weeks after she arrived. Helen set her clipboard on the shelf, looked at the inventory list for a few seconds, and said without preamble, "You are not what they think you are." Nora looked at her. "What do they think I am?" Helen smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that uses the whole face, rather than just the mouth. "They think you are a frightened girl who will settle in and be grateful. That is what most of the entering are, eventually. Grateful." She pulled a candle from the shelf, turned it in her hands, set it back. "You are not frightened. Or you are. But it is not running you." Nora did not confirm or deny. She said, "You've been here a long time." 11 years, Helen said. "I know every room. I know what the rooms are for." She looked at Nora steadily. "I also know things about you that you do not know about yourself yet, about what being here is going to do to you if you let it." "Tell me," Nora said. Helen looked at the door of the corridor. No one was near. "Not yet," she said. "You are too new. If I tell you things too early, you will react, and reacting here is very expensive." She picked up her clipboard again. "But I am going to tell you, in time, because I have watched 17 women come through that front gate in 11 years, and I have watched what happened to most of them, and I am tired of watching." She walked out of the corridor with her clipboard, unhurried, checking boxes on her inventory list as she went. Nora stood among the shelves of candles and breathed carefully, and thought about what had just happened. She had found an ally. She was not certain yet whether Helen was entirely trustworthy, or whether this was itself a test, the compound testing her to see whether she would seek out dissenters. But Helen's eyes had been steady, and her voice had held no performance in it, and Nora had grown up reading the difference between people who were playing a role and people who were saying a real thing. She believed Helen was saying a real thing. She went back to her work table and kept making candles, and that evening at the gathering she listened to Elder Graves speak about the importance of surrendering the instinct to analyze everything, and simply trusting the shared wisdom of the community. And she watched Gordon in the third row nodding along, and she thought about the word alignment painted at the front of the room, and she realized what it actually meant. It did not mean harmony, it meant agreement. Specifically, it meant your agreement with Elder Graves's understanding of everything. The word was painted large, because it was the goal, the destination, the thing they were all moving you toward, without telling you that was where you were going. She nodded along with the others. She looked appropriately thoughtful. She kept her face arranged in the expression that was most useful here, which was the expression of someone who was still figuring things out, still searching, still arriving, which was, she supposed, entirely accurate, just not in the direction they assumed. In those weeks she also came to know more about how the compound handled the outside world. Members were not forbidden from contact with family or friends outside, but contact was managed. Letters, actual paper letters, were the preferred method. Phone calls required approval and were made on a single shared phone in Elder Graves's administrative building, always in the presence of one of the hands. No member had a personal phone. Devices had been collected on arrival. Nora had surrendered hers at the gate on her first day, to Owen, who had told her it would be kept safely for her, and returned when she was ready to leave. When she was ready to leave. The phrase had been so casual that she had not registered it as strange at the time. Now she registered it. She turned it over. Ready to leave was an interesting construction. It implied that leaving was a state you had to arrive at, a decision that required readiness, rather than simply a choice a person could make at any time for any reason. She had not, in 3.5 weeks, seen anyone leave. She had asked Caroline about this, lightly, in the way she asked things she wanted real answers to, without looking directly at Caroline, while both of them were occupied with something else, embedding the question inside a larger conversation, so it did not feel like a question at all. She had mentioned that she had heard Elder Graves say during gathering that several members had moved on to outside lives in the past year, and she said she wondered what that looked like, how that worked. Caroline had said that leaving was always done thoughtfully, that there was a process of consultation with Elder Graves, a period of reflection, and then a gradual transition, that it was handled with care, because the community cared about every member even as they moved on. That it happened, yes, people did leave sometimes, though they usually found, she said with a slight tilt of her head, that the outside world felt much harder than they remembered once they had lived within the order of the circle for any real length of time. Nora had said that made sense. She had moved on to a different subject. She had thought about what Caroline had said all day afterward, peeling it apart. The thing about that answer was not that it was dishonest. It might even have been true, in the way that things shaped by one perspective are true within that perspective. But it described leaving as something difficult, something that would likely not succeed, something the community viewed as a kind of regression rather than a freedom. And it described the process as involving Elder Graves's consultation, which meant Elder Graves's permission, whether or not the word permission was used. Nora had not been given any information about this when she arrived. She had not signed anything that mentioned a process for leaving. But she had also not asked, and the papers she had not been permitted to read might have contained something relevant. She added this to what she was learning. On the last day of her 3rd week, she received a letter from her father. It had already been opened. Not by her. The envelope had been neatly resealed with a strip of tape, and the letter inside, which was written in Gerald Calloway's careful block handwriting on 2 pages of notebook paper, had been folded and unfolded at least once before she received it. She knew this because her father always folded his letters with the written side in, and this one had the written side out. The letter said that he hoped she was settling in well. It said the house was quiet. It said that Elder Graves had been in contact and had given a very positive report of her adjustment. It said he was glad she was in a safe place with good people. It said he loved her, at the very end, in the last line, in letters slightly smaller than the rest, the way people write things they mean, but are not quite practiced at saying. She read the letter 3 times. She folded it carefully, written side in. She put it in the small box under her bed, where she kept the few things she had brought that belonged only to her. She thought about her father knowing that Elder Graves had been in contact, which meant that Elder Graves reported to her father on her behalf, which meant that the channel of information between her and her family ran through Elder Graves, which meant that what her father knew about her life here was what Elder Graves chose to tell him. The weight of this settled over her like a second skin. She lay on her bed and looked at the ceiling and understood, fully and without any remaining ambiguity, that she was inside something designed to hold her, and that the holding was not done with walls or locks but with information and access and the patient management of every line of contact between her and the world outside. And she understood, with the same quiet clarity, that she was going to have to be more patient than they were, more systematic than they were, more careful than they had any reason to expect her to be, because they believed she was a frightened girl from a broken home, who would, in time, be grateful. She was not going to be grateful. She was going to be ready. She kept her record inside her head, as she always did. But she also began keeping a secondary record, in a different form. She memorized the layout of the compound. Not casually, deliberately. She walked every path, used every route that was available to her during the normal course of her day, and every time she walked a route, she updated the floor plan she was building in her mind. She noted which doors were always open, and which were sometimes locked. She noted where the hands spent their time, and on what schedule. She noted where the covered walkways were overlooked from windows, and where they were blind. She noted where you could stand without being seen from any building. She noted the gate. It was not a locked gate in the traditional sense. It was a farm gate, the kind that slides on a rail, heavy enough to deter casual opening but not impossible for one person to move. It was always open during the day for deliveries and member movement, and it was closed but not secured at night. She noted this. She did not yet know what she would do with it, but she noted it with the same automatic precision that she noted everything, because you could not use information you had not gathered. Petra caught her once, on a Tuesday afternoon, walking the far edge of the east building's outer wall, in a route that served no obvious daily purpose. Petra said, "What are you doing?" in the quiet voice she used when she was genuinely curious, rather than performing a question. "Looking at the building," Nora said. "I find it calming." Petra looked at her for a moment, the way she had looked at Nora on that first morning, as though she was reading something in her that she had not decided whether to name. Then she said, "I do that too. Walk around, just to be somewhere that doesn't have an agenda." Nora looked at her. "When I walk," she said carefully, "I try to notice things I haven't noticed before, things I've passed a lot of times but not really looked at." Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I look at the gate sometimes, the main gate." A pause. "It's not locked at night." Nora said nothing. The two of them stood at the edge of the building in the thin autumn light, and neither of them said the thing that was in the air between them, because neither of them was ready, and the moment did not need words to be what it was. They walked back toward the east wing. Petra went to the common room. Nora went to her bed and sat on the edge of it and thought that she was not as alone in this as she had been 3 weeks ago, and that this was a thing she needed to think about carefully before she thought about it with hope. The thing about the vault was that Nora did not find it. She was led to it, carefully, over time, by people who believed they were doing her a favor. It began with the study groups. In her second month, she was moved from the general morning study sessions to a smaller group that met in the evenings in a side room off the gathering hall. There were 8 people in this group, all of them women, between the ages of 17 and 30. The leader was a woman named Audrey, who was 34, and who had been at the compound for 7 years, and who was one of the 4 hands, one of Elder Graves's most trusted people. Audrey was lean and precise in her movements, and spoke with the particular tone of someone who has been told, often enough, and by someone they admire, that they are exceptional. The move to the smaller group was presented as a recognition of Nora's potential. Doris, who managed the East Wing, told her one afternoon that Elder Graves had noticed her attentiveness, and her work quality, and her manner in the community, and that he felt she would benefit from, and contribute to, a more concentrated study environment. It was said as a compliment. Nora received it as a compliment. She said thank you, and meant none of it, and showed up to the first evening session with the face of someone who was honored. The small group studied different material than the general membership. Where the main morning sessions covered Elder Graves's booklet in large portions, the evening group went deeper, into what Audrey called the foundational understanding. This was a set of older writings, some from Elder Graves himself in earlier decades, some from other sources that were not attributed by name, only described as the received teachings. These writings were denser than the booklet, more philosophical, harder to read in the casual sense, and for this reason, Audrey explained, they were not appropriate for newer or younger members who had not yet developed what she called the capacity for real discernment. Nora listened to this and made the appropriate expressions and thought, they are not giving you this because you are special. They are giving you this because they have determined that you are intelligent enough to be useful, and they want to see how you respond to more direct shaping before they invest more in you. She was right, though it would take her another month to understand the full picture. The foundational teachings contained things the booklet did not. The booklet spoke about the disordered outside world in vague, gentle terms. The foundational teachings were more specific. They described the majority of people outside the circle as living in what was called willful unconsciousness, not merely lost, but actively choosing not to see. They described families who were not part of the circle as systems of harm that members had escaped. They described the ties between a member and their pre-circle life as chains disguised as connections, and they taught that releasing those ties, fully, without guilt, was not an abandonment, but a liberation, both for the member and, eventually, for the people they had been connected to, who would ultimately benefit from the member's growth, even if they could not understand it now. This was where Nora felt, for the first time, something she could only describe as a cold recognition, not cold like fear, cold like the moment you touch something and realize instantly what it is made of. She had been reading the foundational teachings for 2 weeks when she found this passage. She sat with it. She read it again. She thought about what it would do to a person who came to the compound already carrying hurt about their family, someone whose parents had been difficult, whose siblings had been unkind, whose history had edges that were easy to assign blame to. She thought about how this passage, received by such a person, would not feel like a manipulation. It would feel like relief, like finally being given permission to put something down, like someone understanding what they had been through and giving it a name. She thought about how, for her specifically, this passage was trying to do something to the way she felt about her father. She did not let it, but she understood why it worked on others. The 8 women in her small group were at various stages of what Audrey, without calling it that, was guiding them through. Nora could see it now, with the foundational teachings as context. There was a woman named Bet who was 26 and who had grown up in a home with a difficult mother and who, over the weeks, was visibly releasing the complexity of that relationship and replacing it with a simpler story. The mother, as part of the disordered world. The circle, as the place where Bet had found what the mother had failed to give her. The story was not entirely false, but it was flattened in a way that removed Bet's ability to examine it, because flat stories are easier to carry, and the people who want you to carry stories without examining them know this well. There was a woman named Cora who was 21, and had come to the compound seeking structure after what she described, vaguely, as a difficult period. Cora was at the stage of grateful attachment. She believed entirely in elder graves, believed in the circle, believed that what she had found here was the thing she had been missing, and she talked about the outside world with the particular sadness of someone who has been taught to feel sorry for people they used to be, and places they used to love. Cora was being managed carefully, Nora could see, given enough recognition to keep her engaged, enough challenge to keep her feeling that she was growing, not so much freedom that she might outgrow the need for the structure. And there was Petra, Nora's roommate, who still braided cord when she thought no one was watching, who still pressed her lips together when she thought about her sister. Petra was at the stage of managed conflict. She was deep enough in the teachings to feel the pull of them, but still carrying enough of her original self to feel the loss of what was outside. This was, Nora understood, a dangerous stage for the compound. People at this stage could still go either direction. The evening group was, among other things, a mechanism for moving people like Petra past that crossroads and firmly into full belief, before the outside life could reclaim them. Nora watched all of this with the steady attention of a person who has decided that watching carefully is the only honest contribution they can make to a situation they cannot yet fully change. In the 6th week, Audrey began working with the group on what she called the vocabulary of clarity. This was a set of specific terms that the foundational teachings used, which members were encouraged to adopt in their daily speech because, Audrey explained, language shaped thought, and the right language accelerated the development of real discernment. The words were not strange words, which would have been easy to resist. They were ordinary words, used with specific, curated meanings. Connection, in the circle's vocabulary, meant specifically a tie that supported your growth within the order, not simply a relationship with another person. Noise meant not just sound, but any input from outside the circle. News, outside opinions, conversations with non-members. Clarity meant not simply understanding, but agreement with Elder Graves's framework. A person who had achieved clarity was not someone who had thought deeply and arrived at their own conclusions. A person who had achieved clarity was someone who had stopped questioning the framework and begun operating from inside it. Nora used the words. She used them carefully in conversation with Audrey and the others, in the right contexts, with the right tone. Using them was not the same as believing them. She had learned from watching the compound that belief was not required. Performance of belief was what was monitored. What was inside you was your own, as long as the surface was accurate. This was also, she recognized, a kind of survival skill that had costs she would need to think about later. Performing something long enough changes you whether you intend it to or not. She had to be careful. She had to keep the line between what she was performing and what she was thinking clearly marked, because the compound's whole project was the erosion of that line. Helen found her in the candle corridor again in the 7th week. Helen set down her clipboard and said, "They have put you in the evening group." "Yes," Nora said. Helen looked at her steadily. "Good. That is good, actually. Not because of what they will teach you there, because of what you will learn about how the teaching works. If you are watching." She paused. "Are you watching?" "Yes," Nora said. Helen nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Elder Graves has a room at the back of the administrative building. The members call it the study. The hands and the senior members call it the vault. Not to his face. Among themselves. Because it is where he keeps the things that the teachings do not say out loud." Nora waited. She did not press. She had learned that Helen told things in their own time. "The vault is real," Helen said. "Not a metaphor. An actual room, with actual documents and actual records. The founding documents of the circle. The records of every person who has entered through that gate. Correspondence with people outside. Financial records. And, more importantly, the original versions of the teachings. The drafts before they were made smooth." She looked at Nora carefully. "The original drafts say things the current booklet does not. They are very honest, in the original drafts, about what this place is for." "Have you seen them?" Nora said. "I was in the vault once," Helen said. 12 years ago, before I came here. I was given access as part of a decision about whether to join. Elder Graves, when he is recruiting someone he wants at a high level, sometimes shows them a version of the vault, a curated version. He showed me things that impressed me, things that seemed to prove the depth and seriousness of what he was building. She paused again. "What I did not understand, at the time, was that the things he showed me were selected. The rest of the documents, the ones he did not show me, would have answered every question I had not thought to ask yet." Nora absorbed this. "Can it be accessed now, without him knowing?" Helen smiled, not warmly. "The way you smile when something confirms what you already knew. That is why I am telling you. Because you are the first person in 11 years who has walked into this compound with the kind of mind that might figure out how." She picked up her clipboard. "I am not going to help you take the risk. I am too old, and too tired, and I have a way of surviving here that depends on my invisibility. But I wanted you to know the vault exists, because knowing something exists is the first step toward deciding what to do about it." She walked out. Nora stood in the corridor and breathed through the information, slow and steady, the way she had learned to process things that were large. The vault, the original documents, a room at the back of the administrative building, a man who had been running this system for long enough to have original drafts. Records of every person who had ever entered, her own record presumably, her father's name, the paperwork from the transaction in the room with the old wood and the candle wax. She stood there until the information settled into her body and became something she could carry. Then she went back to her work table and kept making candles, and she thought, for the first time since she had arrived, about the very specific patience that would be required, and how long she might have to wait, and whether she was capable of that kind of waiting. She looked at the candles. She had made 431 of them in 7 weeks. She knew exactly how many, because she had counted, because counting things was a way of staying grounded, a way of reminding herself that time was real, and that it moved, even inside a place that was designed to make it feel like it stood still. She counted the candles and thought about the vault, and decided that she was capable of whatever was required. She was 17 years old, which meant she had very little to compare this to. But she also had very little to lose that she had not already lost, which is sometimes the condition that produces the most dangerous kind of clarity. She picked up another candle. She set it in its place. She kept going. She kept going past the candle corridor that afternoon, past the storage shelves and the empty corner where the winter supply was stacked in brown boxes, and she walked the full length of the covered walkway to the far end, where the east wing met the old garden wall, and she stood there for a few minutes in the cold with her arms at her sides, breathing steadily, because breathing steadily was a thing she had learned to do when the information she was carrying was heavier than usual, and she needed to redistribute it. The vault. She turned the word over again. A room, Helen had said. Documents. Drafts before they were made smooth. Financial records. The records of every person who had entered through the gate. She thought about what it would mean to have access to those records. Not just confirmation of what she already suspected, but the specific language, the specific terms, the names of the families, and the amounts, and the correspondence. Evidence in the way that evidence needs to be. Written, dated, signed, specific enough to be hard to dismiss. She thought about what kind of evidence she already had, inside her own mind. She had a sharp memory. She had been using it as a tool since she arrived, storing details in the careful architecture of her attention. But testimony from memory, from a 17-year-old girl who had been inside a compound for a few weeks or months, was a different category of thing than paper with ink on it. Paper was what changed rooms. Paper was what made officials sit up straight. She went back to her work table and kept making candles, and the afternoon moved through its ordinary paces, and all around her the compound went on being what it was, controlled, warm at the surface, organized in every visible dimension. She watched a child of about 5 run across the common area between the main house and the east wing, chasing a ball that had rolled under a bench. The child caught it and laughed. The laugh was real. The child was happy. This was also true, alongside everything else, that there were real moments inside this place, real warmth, real laughter, real people who had found something here that was not entirely a construction. She thought about this complexity for a long time. She thought about what it meant that you could be harmed by a place that also contained good things. She thought about how the good things were not a refutation of the harm, but also not irrelevant to the truth of the experience. She thought about how the world outside the compound was also complicated, also contained both harm and warmth in the same spaces, and how Elder Graves's entire operating logic depended on the outside world appearing unambiguously worse, while this place appeared unambiguously better, and how the reality was that both places contained the same human mixture, just with different power structures and different levels of honesty about what those power structures were doing. The child picked up the ball and ran back inside. The common area was empty again. The afternoon was thinning toward evening. She finished her candle count and wrote the number in the production log, and the number was correct, as it always was, and she handed the log to the woman who collected them, and went to wash her hands before the evening gathering. She thought about Helen's garden as she walked. Small things in poor soil, kept alive not because they were impressive but because they were hers. She thought about the specific stubbornness of that act, 11 years of going back to a bad patch of ground every day, and growing something in it, not to show anyone, not to prove anything, just because the decision had been made, and keeping it was the point. She was not going to be here 11 years. She knew that with the same certainty that she knew the candle counts. But she was going to have to be patient, and patience required something to tend, and what she was tending was the careful knowledge she was building, day by day, of how this place worked, and where its architecture had seams. The gathering room filled up around her. Elder Graves stood at the front. The word alignment was above him, large and very still. She sat in her usual place, and arranged her face, and held, very privately, everything she had learned that day, and she waited. The first poison tasted sweet. That was the part Nora had not anticipated. She had been braced for something bitter, something she would recognize as wrong the moment it reached her. But the first thing that began to change inside her did not feel like damage. It felt, in the worst possible way, like relief. It began in the 3rd month, during the part of each day that should have been the easiest to withstand. She had been assigned a new role in addition to candle making. Audrey told her, one morning, that Elder Graves had requested she work alongside the senior members during the afternoon hours, assisting with what was called the correspondence work. This meant sitting in a long room adjoining the administrative building, at a table with 4 other women, and helping to manage the written communication between the circle and its network of supporters and affiliates outside the compound. The circle had, it turned out, a much larger reach than it appeared from the inside. There were families in surrounding counties who sent monthly contributions. There were community members who lived in the outside world and attended quarterly gatherings. There were businesses that bought the compound's handmade goods at prices above market value, as a form of quiet support. And there were people whom Elder Graves had, over the years, helped during difficult periods of their lives, people who credited him with their recovery, or their peace, or their changed direction, and who remained connected to the circle, in ways that varied from financial to simply loyal. The correspondence was managed in a specific way. Outgoing letters from Elder Graves were drafted in his voice by Audrey, and then reviewed by him. Outgoing letters from the community were composed by the senior women, and signed by members as though they had written them personally. Incoming letters were read first by the correspondence team, summarized, and only the summaries were passed to Elder Graves, unless a letter contained something he had specifically flagged as requiring his direct attention. This meant, Nora understood immediately, that the information reaching Elder Graves about the outside world was filtered through the women in this room, and the information reaching the outside world about the community was filtered through Elder Graves. She was given incoming letters to read and summarize. It was, by accident or design, the most informative position she could have been placed in. She read everything. She summarized accurately and completely, because anything less would have drawn attention to her. But she also read between the lines. She read letters from people whose tone shifted over time from warmth to uncertainty to absence. She read letters from family members of current compound residents, letters full of questions that were never directly answered by the outgoing correspondents, letters that said, "We just want to know she is doing well," and "Can you tell us when we might be able to visit?" and, in a few cases, "Please, we are worried." These letters never went to Elder Graves as complete documents. They went as summaries, and the summaries, she noticed, consistently reduced the urgency and the worry in the original letters. A letter that said, "We are scared for our daughter," became, in summary, "The family sends their regards and is interested in receiving an update on her well-being." The summary was not a lie. It was a translation, and the purpose of the translation was to make the world outside seem calmer and more manageable than it actually was. She filed this. She kept her face exactly as she needed it to be. And then, in the middle of the third month, Audrey sat with her after an evening session and talked to her for nearly an hour. Not about the teachings, not about the compound, about Nora. Audrey said she had been watching her, and that what she saw was a young woman who was carrying a great deal of weight that was not hers to carry. She said she could see the marks of a childhood that had not provided what a child should have. She said, and this was the moment Nora later identified as the beginning of the first poison, that Nora deserved, for perhaps the first time in her life, to be seen. She said this word, seen, and she held Nora's gaze while she said it, and there was nothing in Audrey's face at that moment that was calculation. Whatever Audrey had been taught to do, however deliberately she was executing it, the warmth in her voice was not entirely manufactured. She believed it. She had been shaped by the same compound that was now shaping Nora, and she had arrived at a place where she genuinely believed that what she was doing was kindness, which made it far more effective than simple manipulation ever could have been. Nora felt something shift, not dramatically, just a fraction, like a bone that has been held at a wrong angle for a long time and then moves, without warning, toward a more natural position. She had been tense for 3 months. She had been watching, calculating, performing. She had been, she realized in the warmth of Audrey's attention, exhausted. She did not cry, she did not break, but she let herself receive the warmth, just a little. And that small reception was the first poison beginning its work. The compound's kindness was not fake. That was the thing she could never fully square, even later, even when she understood every mechanism behind it. The people there were, in the majority, genuinely kind to one another. The mornings were warm. The meals were shared with real conversation. There was laughter, genuine laughter, not performed cheerfulness, in the common rooms. Caroline, her first roommate, checked on her regularly in the way that people who have learned to care do, even when they have learned to care within a managed system. Frances, the woman who had poured her tea on the first morning, continued to pour it, every morning, without being asked. When you are 17, and you have come from a house that tilted and broke, and you arrive in a place where people pour your tea without being asked, and an intelligent woman tells you, directly and steadily, that you deserve to be seen, the poison in this is not that the kindness is false. The poison is that the kindness has a price tag, and the price tag is invisible until you are too attached to walk away from it. Audrey began meeting with Nora twice a week, one-on-one, in addition to the group sessions. These meetings were called mentorship conversations, and they were presented as part of Nora's development within the community. In them, Audrey asked Nora questions about her history, carefully, patiently, not intrusively but consistently, where she had grown up, what her house had been like, what her father was like, what she had wanted for herself before she came here. Nora answered carefully. She gave true answers but incomplete ones. She described her father with honesty, but not with the bitterness she was being gently guided toward. She described her childhood as difficult, but not as something that required repudiation. She watched where Audrey leaned in, where her questions became slightly more specific, where she reflected Nora's words back to her with a subtle shift in emphasis, taking Nora's, "my father was struggling," and returning it as, "your father put you in a situation he should not have put you in," which was true, but which meant something different, which did not describe him as a person who failed, but as a person who harmed. Nora received these reflections without correcting them. She appeared to absorb them. She did absorb them, partially, which was the danger, because information you let into your mind, even information you intend to examine and set aside, does not stay neatly in the corner where you put it. It moves around at night, when you are not watching. It settles into the gaps. She began noticing, in the 4th month, that she thought about her father slightly differently than she had before. The difference was small. She caught it quickly. But it was there, a slight extra edge in her memory of the day he signed the papers, a slight shift toward his culpability, and away from the larger circumstances that had produced the moment. But recognizing it did not entirely undo it, and this was the thing about the first poison. It worked even when you could name it. She went to Helen in the candle corridor and described what was happening. Helen listened with her steady eyes and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "They are very good at this. They have had a great deal of practice." "I know what they are doing," Nora said. "It is not working the way it works on the others." "Some of it is working," Helen said, not unkindly. "Knowing the name of a thing does not immunize you against it entirely, especially when the thing they are doing is also real. Audrey does care about you, in her way. The warmth is not entirely engineered. It is genuine warmth being used for a specific purpose, which is the most difficult kind of thing to resist, because to resist it, you have to also refuse some of the genuine part." Nora sat with this. "What do I do?" "You keep your center separate," Helen said. "You let them see the surface responding, but underneath, you keep a thing they cannot touch, a part of yourself that you have not given them access to. And you remind yourself of that part regularly, so it does not erode." "How do you do that?" Nora said. "For 11 years?" Helen was quiet. She looked at the candles on the shelf. "I have a garden," she said, "behind the east wing. No one else uses it. A very small piece of ground that is mine, in the only real way anything can be yours in a place like this, which is that I was the one who decided to plant things there, and no one told me to, and no one knows it matters to me. It is ugly. The soil is poor. The things I grow are small." She looked at Nora. "Find your garden." Nora thought about this for the rest of the day. She thought about what, inside her, could not be reached and shaped by Audrey's careful questions, and the evening group's vocabulary, and the kindness that had a price. She thought about what was entirely her own. She found it in the counting, the way she counted candles, counted days, counted details and filed them. The part of her that watched and recorded without expressing. The part of her that had decided, on the first morning, to keep her eyes open. That part had not been given to her by the compound. It had not been installed by Elder Graves or Audrey, or the foundational teachings. It was a thing she had built herself, in her father's house, when keeping track of small truths was the only way to hold on to what was real. She kept it. She went to it deliberately, every day, in the moments between things, standing at her work table, lying on her bed in the dark, walking the covered walkways between buildings. She reminded herself, "Here is the part you do not give to anyone. Here is the part that is yours." And she let the surface respond to Audrey's warmth, because resisting entirely would have been suspicious, and because Helen was right that some of the warmth was real, and she was not required to harden herself against every real thing in the world in order to survive one place that was using real things against her. She walked a line, every day, between receiving enough to stay safe and giving away enough to stay hidden. It was the most demanding performance she had ever attempted. There were moments when she was not sure which side of the line she was on. But she kept counting. She kept the garden. She got better at the line. And every evening, sitting in the evening group with Audrey and the 7 other women, she watched the teachings work on the people around her, and held, very carefully, the dual knowledge of what it felt like from the inside, and what it looked like from the outside, and she told herself, you can know both things. You can survive both things, just do not confuse them. She did not confuse them. The first poison kept working, slowly, on the edges, but the center held. The 4th month brought something she had not anticipated, a moment of genuine enjoyment. She was in the workroom, late on a Friday, after most of the other members had moved to the common area for the free hour before dinner. She had stayed to finish a batch, and in the quiet of the room with the smell of warm wax around her, and the low light from the overhead lamp, she had found herself in a state that was not calculation, and not performance, and not resistance. It was simply the state of a person doing a physical task that their hands knew well, and it was, for those 30 minutes, uncomplicated. She noticed this. She sat with it carefully. She thought about what it meant that she could feel something like peace, in a place that she had every honest reason to want to leave. She thought about whether feeling peace here was a sign that the compound was succeeding in something, or whether peace was simply something that happened to human bodies when they were warm and occupied and not in immediate danger, regardless of the context. She decided it was the second thing, but she also did not discount the first thing entirely, because the compound's techniques were real, and they had access to the real things, the warmth, the occupation, the absence of immediate danger, and used them deliberately. She made a rule for herself. She was allowed to feel whatever she genuinely felt. She was not going to police her own inner states in the name of resistance, because policing your inner states is what the compound did, and she was not going to do the compound's work for it from the inside. If the wax smelled good, she would allow that it smelled good. If Frances's tea was warm, and she was glad to have it, she would be glad. These things were true. They could be true alongside everything else. The art was in holding them, without letting them become arguments for staying, without letting the genuine warmth be translated by the compound's logic into evidence that the compound was good. She finished the candles. She turned off the lamp. She went to dinner. The center held. It always held, through the 4th month, and this was a thing she would not understand the value of until much later, when she would talk to people who had lost their center in places like this one, and had spent years trying to find it again, in the ruins of who they had been before. She kept hers. She went to dinner. She counted the candles in her mind. She was still exactly herself. In the last week of the 4th month, Audrey gave the evening group an assignment that each member was to complete privately. The assignment was to write, in their own words, a description of the connection between their life before the circle and their life inside it. Specifically, what had been different, what had changed, and what they believed about the direction they were moving. The assignment was to be submitted to Audrey by the following Wednesday. No one was told that the submissions would be shared or discussed beyond Audrey herself. The frame was personal reflection. The function, Nora understood, was a progress report that each member was unknowingly writing about themselves. She spent 2 days thinking about what to write. The answer had to serve 2 purposes simultaneously. It had to read as genuine progress in the direction the compound expected, or Audrey would flag her as stalled. But it also had to be, at the level of the actual words on the page, something that was factually true, because she had decided that she would not write outright falsehoods in any document that existed in the compound's possession, not out of principle in the abstract sense. Out of the practical recognition that her ability to live with herself through this process depended on keeping the line between performance and lie very clearly marked. Performance was using the right expressions. A lie was creating a false record. She wrote about the change in her sense of structure. This was true. Her life at the compound had more structure than her life before. She wrote about the experience of being part of a community that functioned with shared purpose. This was also true, in the way that facts are true, even when their context changes their meaning. She wrote about feeling, for the first time in her life, that what she did each day mattered to the people around her. This was the most careful line she wrote, and it took her the longest, and what made it safe was that it was genuine. The candle work mattered, in the compound's economy, and the people around her noticed it and said so, and feeling that one's work matters is not a compound-specific experience, it is a human one. She handed the assignment to Audrey on Wednesday. Audrey read it and said, with the smile that meant she had found what she was looking for, that Nora was doing really well. Nora said she was grateful for the opportunity to reflect. She had selected each word in that sentence the same way she selected each candle from the production line, checking for flaws before setting it in its place. There came a Tuesday in her 5th month when Nora woke up and did not immediately know where she was. Not because she had forgotten, because the room, the narrow bed, the window over the garden, Caroline's soft breathing from across the space, had become familiar enough that her waking mind processed it the way you process your own home. It arrived without surprise, without the small recoil of wrong place that she had felt every morning for the first 2 months. She lay there for a moment. She recognized this. She had been told to watch for it. Helen had described it once, in the candle corridor, as the morning you stop landing. The moment the compound became the default setting of your mind, rather than a place you were being held. She had been told to recognize it, and not to panic about it, because it was not defeat. It was what happened when a human body was given no alternative. The body normalized. That was its job. The mind followed the body until you actively redirected it. She got up. She went to the small window and looked at the garden for exactly 30 seconds, which was a habit she had developed to anchor the part of herself that counted. 30 seconds of looking at something real before the day's performances began. She was in her 5th month, and she was running out of patience in the way that a clock runs down, not dramatically, but measurably, one small unit at a time. The evening group had moved past the foundational teachings into what Audrey called practical alignment, which was essentially a set of guided exercises in which each member was asked to examine her relationships with people outside the compound and assess, using the vocabulary of the circle, whether those relationships supported or obstructed her growth. The assessment was not random. It was structured in a way that consistently produced a specific conclusion, which was that relationships outside the circle were, almost without exception, either neutral, meaning distant enough to be irrelevant, or obstructive, meaning connected enough to pull you back toward the disordered world. This was the second poison. Nora had been watching it work on others for weeks, and now it was being administered directly to her. Audrey guided her through the exercise in their private mentorship meeting in the 5th month. She asked Nora to think about the most significant relationship she had with someone outside the compound. Nora said her father. Audrey nodded and began asking questions in the tone she always used for this. Warm, concerned, entirely without judgment in her voice, while her questions all moved in a single direction. Had Nora's father listened to her, really listened, before making the decision that brought her here? Had he asked what she wanted? Had he considered what she needed, or what was easiest for him in a difficult moment? Nora answered honestly, because honest answers served her here. They were more credible, they showed she was engaging, and they were harder to catch in inconsistency than constructed ones. She said her father had been in a desperate position. She said he had not asked her what she wanted. That was true. She said she thought he had believed what Elder Graves told him about the compound being a good place for her. She said she could not judge him for acting on incomplete information in a desperate moment. Audrey listened to all of this. Then she said, gently, Nora, you are defending him very carefully. Have you considered why? This was the move. Nora had been waiting for it. What do you mean? You are describing what might have been in his mind. You are creating explanations for his behavior that minimize how it affected you. That is a very understandable thing to do. Many of us learn to protect the people who have hurt us, because the alternative, really feeling how we have been hurt, is very painful. Audrey's voice was low and even, but protecting them with our minds keeps us tied to the pain. The teaching asks us to see the relationship clearly, without the protection, not to hate the person, to simply see what actually happened. Nora sat with this. She let the appropriate silence form. Then she said, I do feel hurt by it. I know you do, Audrey said, and her voice shifted into warmth. That is honest. That is real. You do not have to protect him with me, not here. Nora let a small amount of visible emotion surface. Not performance, she pulled from something real, something genuinely painful, and allowed it to be seen. She did this deliberately. She had learned that the most convincing performances used real materials, and she had learned that showing some genuine pain to Audrey was safer than showing none, because a person who showed none was either healed or hiding, and being thought to be hiding was more dangerous. What she did not show Audrey was the part that ran underneath the visible emotion, the part that noted every feature of what was happening, that cataloged the exact technique being used, that was watching Audrey the way a scientist watches a procedure, not with detachment, but with the specific attention of someone who needs to understand every step. After the meeting, she walked the covered walkway between the administrative wing and the east building and thought about what the second poison was actually designed to do. It was not simply designed to make her think badly of her father. It was more precise than that. It was designed to sever, one careful incision at a time, the emotional reality of the life she had lived before the compound. If she could be guided into seeing her father not as a complicated, struggling man who had made a terrible decision, but as a category, as someone who had hurt her, who was part of the disordered world, who she was better off without, then the thread connecting her to the outside became not a lifeline but a wound. And wounds you let heal. Wounds you close. She understood this. She did not let it happen. But she could feel the effort it cost her to resist it, and she could feel that the cost was accumulating. In that same 5th month, she noticed the change in Bet. Bet, who had come in carrying complicated feelings about her difficult mother, had passed through the place of managed conflict and arrived somewhere on the other side. She still talked about her mother, but differently now. The complexity was gone. The mother had become, in Bet's spoken account of her own history, a clear figure, someone who had been cold, who had not seen Bet's worth, who had damaged her in ways that the circle's teachings had helped her understand. This was presented as healing. Bet presented it as healing. She said she had put down the weight of that relationship. She said she felt lighter. She did look lighter. Her face had a kind of peace that Nora watched carefully. It was real peace, in the sense that Bet had genuinely stopped suffering over her mother. But it was peace purchased at the cost of nuance, and what was lost with nuance was the ability to revise. Bet could not, now, add new information to her understanding of her mother. The account was closed, it was clean, and it was settled, and it was finished. And finished, in this context, meant permanently separated, not just from the pain, but from the person. Nora thought about Petra, who still pressed her lips together when she thought about her sister. Petra had not yet arrived at the place Bet was in. She was still in pain, still in conflict, still carrying the relationship as a living thing. This was, in the compound's logic, a sign that she had not yet healed. But Nora looked at Petra's pressed lips and the tension in her hands, and thought, this is the last honest evidence of what you actually feel. Once this goes, once you stop feeling this particular pain, you will not get it back. She tried, one evening in their room, to say something adjacent to this to Petra, without triggering Petra's trained responses. She said that she missed the people outside sometimes. Just that. She said she thought about them. Petra looked at her. There was a flicker. I think about my sister, Petra said, very quietly, in a voice she did not use in the common spaces. Nora kept her face still. That makes sense, she said. She is your sister. Audrey says that the bond I feel is real, but that it is weighted with patterns that do not serve me, that what I am feeling as love is also mixed with obligation and guilt, which are not love. That might be true, Nora said carefully. Some of it might be, but it is hard to know which part is which without talking to her. Petra looked at the window for a moment. Then she said, in the same very quiet voice, I asked to write her a letter, a real one, not the kind they draft. My own words. What happened? Audrey said it was a good impulse, but that the timing was important, that if I wrote to her now, from where I currently am in my understanding, the letter might not help either of us. She paused. She said, when I was further along, the letter would be better, more considered. Nora nodded. She said nothing else. She could not say what she was thinking, which was, there will always be a reason the timing is not right, that is the point. You will be further along, and then there will be another reason, and eventually far enough along will mean the letter is never written, because you have reached the place where you believe the letter is not needed, which means the sister is gone, and the belief that she was always part of the disorder has become the whole story. She could not say this to Petra, not yet. Petra was not ready to hear it, and saying it too early would have reported back to Audrey by morning, because Petra, despite the quiet voice and the pressed lips, was still navigating the compound by its rules. Nora lay in her bed that night and calculated. She was 5 months in. She had learned the system of the correspondence room. She had learned the location of the vault, or its approximate location, the general area, enough to begin looking more specifically. She had learned which members were truly committed, and which were, beneath the surface, still in some degree of conflict. She had learned Audrey's technique well enough to recognize each step of it as it was applied. She had learned Elder Graves's schedule, which was more regular than he likely knew. He ate at the same time, took the same route between buildings each afternoon, spent the same 2 hours in the administrative block before the evening gathering. She had also learned that the administrative block was locked at night, that Doris held one set of keys, and Elder Graves held another, and that the vault room, based on what Helen had said and what Nora had been able to observe from the outside of the building, was at the back of the block in a room with no window facing outward. She had also learned, this was the piece she returned to most carefully, that every month, on the first Sunday, Elder Graves hosted a dinner for the hands and the senior members that lasted from late afternoon until late evening. During this dinner, which was held in the elders' private dining room in the main house, the administrative block was unoccupied. The dinner was the one window she could identify in the schedule, during which the block would be empty, without requiring anyone to be absent who would notice their own absence. She was not yet ready to move on this. She was not ready for a reason that was not patience. She was not ready because she still did not know exactly what she would do with what was in the vault. She could not take documents. She could not leave. She had no access to communication that was not monitored. What she needed first was a clearer picture of how many people were in the same position she was in. Who else was aware? Who else was watching without showing it? Because she was not going to be able to do what needed to be done alone. She thought about Helen, who said she was too old and too tired. She thought about Petra, who was not yet far enough along in her conflict to act from it. She thought about the letters she read in the correspondence room, the families saying, "Please, we are worried." She had been adding those families' names to her own private record, a thing she kept in her head because paper was too dangerous. Names, dates, the approximate dates of arrival of the members they were writing about. She had been memorizing them the same way she memorized candle counts, steadily, reliably, without drama. She had 41 names. She went to sleep holding all 41 of them. And she went to sleep not quite ready but moving steadily toward ready, the way the sky moves toward dawn. Too slowly to see in any given moment, but completely, and without stopping. On the 35th day of her 5th month, she was asked to do something she had not been asked to do before. One of the hands, a woman named Greta, who was 40 and who had been at the compound since her mid-20s, and who was, in Nora's assessment, the most functionally capable person in Elder Graves's inner circle, came to the correspondence room and told Nora that she would be accompanying 2 senior members to a county market event the following week. Not to sell goods, to manage the public-facing communication with members of the community who would be coming specifically to meet with the circle's representatives about the quarterly gathering. It was the first time she had been included in an outside-facing activity. She said she would be glad to help. She maintained the expression of someone who was honored by the trust this represented. Inside, she had precisely one thought. She was going to be outside the compound. She spent the next 6 days in a state of heightened attention that she kept entirely off her face. She thought about whether to act on the outside opportunity in the 5th month, whether the plan was ready, whether she was ready. She concluded that she was not. The documentation issue was the sticking point. She could not go to an official with only her memory and no paper. She needed the vault first, and she had not yet been inside it. Going out and making contact without the documentation would give the compound time to manage the situation before there was anything hard enough to force a real response. She went to the market event. She sat at the circle's information table for 3 hours and spoke to people who were curious about the quarterly gathering, and she used the vocabulary she had been given and answered questions with the information she had been given, and she watched the outside world move past the table with the particular texture of ordinary life. People with bags of groceries, children running ahead of their parents, a man selling vegetables who was talking to no one in particular about the weather. She took in every detail, the name of the street, the pharmacy on the north edge, the public telephone she spotted on the pharmacy wall through its window, the pattern of the crowd, the thickness of it, the way it absorbed people moving through it. She filed all of it. She went back to the compound. She kept waiting. The waiting was harder after the market, because the outside was now recent and specific in her mind rather than abstract. But harder was not impossible. and she had been doing impossible things in ordinary language for months. She was going to be ready. She kept counting toward it. She also thought, in those days, about the children at the compound. There were 11 children. They ranged in age from 3 to 14. Some had been born inside the community, to members who had met and formed families there. Some had come in with parents who had joined, or been brought in when the children were small. They went to a schoolroom inside the compound that was run by a woman named Marion, who was a former primary school teacher, and who taught reading and mathematics and history, in a version that Nora, having now read the foundational teachings carefully, understood was curated in ways a standard curriculum inspector would not have recognized or approved. The children were not unhappy. This was the hardest thing to look at directly. They played in the common areas. They laughed. They had a world inside the compound that was full enough to feel complete, because they had no memory of anything that contradicted it. A child of 8 who has grown up inside a closed community does not feel the absence of the outside world the way an adult does, because the outside world is not an absence to them. It is simply a category of things that are not here, and children live in the here, with extraordinary commitment. She thought about what happened to those children as they aged inside the system. She thought about what it meant to grow up with Elder Graves's vocabulary, as the entire vocabulary you had for understanding your own experience. She thought about the 14-year-old girl named Lucy, who had been born at the compound and who moved through it with the confidence of someone who belongs entirely to a place, and who sometimes helped Nora carry boxes in the supply room, and who talked, always, about things inside the compound, things she was learning, things she had made in Marion's class, things she was going to do in the community when she was older. Lucy was not in Nora's plan. No single person was in Nora's plan except Petra. But Lucy was in her mind, and the 11 children were in her mind, and they remained there, not as a source of urgency that would make her move too fast, but as a source of certainty that what she was moving toward mattered beyond herself, and beyond the people she could name. She kept going, she kept counting. She kept her face arranged in its useful expression, and behind it, she kept her real one. She was not supposed to be in the administrative corridor that Wednesday. She was supposed to be in the correspondence room with the other women, sorting the month's incoming letters, but Doris had sent her to retrieve a box of archived files from the supply room on the far end of the administrative block, because the compound's filing system was one of those things that looked organized from a distance and was entirely chaotic on closer examination, and the supply room was the one space in the block that was never locked, because it held only paper and binders, and nothing Elder Graves cared about protecting. She was in the corridor, carrying the box, on her way back. She heard voices through the wall. The administrative block had been built in stages over the years, and the result was that the walls between rooms were not all equally thick. Some corridors had been added later, running alongside original rooms, and the original walls had not been insulated for privacy, because insulation cost money, and Elder Graves spent money on things that were visible. The result was that, in 2 specific places in the corridor, she had mapped them, mentally, in previous weeks. The voices from the interior rooms came through clearly enough to understand. She had never heard anything significant at those spots. She had passed them dozens of times. She had never stopped, because stopping for longer than a natural pause would have been visible to anyone watching, and someone was always watching. But that Wednesday, the voices were louder than usual, and she caught her name. She set the box down. She bent over it, as though she was checking the contents, which was a natural thing to do.
She stayed bent over the box for the 30 seconds that it was safe to stay bent over a box, and she listened.
There were 2 voices, Elder Graves and a man she recognized as Warren, one of the 4 hands. Warren was 50-something, and precise, and she had always felt, watching him at meals and gatherings, that he was the most genuinely intelligent person in Elder Graves's inner circle, which made him also the most precisely managed. Elder Graves said, "She is further along than I expected." Audrey's report this week was strong, Warren said. She is also more contained than the others at this stage. The emotional response has been there, but it does not spill. I am not certain whether that is depth or performance. There was a pause. Then Elder Graves. It does not matter, at this stage. What I am interested in is her capacity. She has been managing the correspondence work for 3 months, and Audrey tells me she has not missed an error, not filed a thing incorrectly, not let anything slip. She has the attention of someone twice her age. Warren said something she did not fully catch. Then Elder Graves, more clearly, if she aligns fully, and I believe she will be more useful than anyone we have brought in the last decade. The question is not whether she aligns. The question is when, and what role she is placed in when she does. She straightened up. She picked up the box. She walked at the pace that was appropriate for carrying a box of files, which was steady but not hurried, and she went back to the correspondence room, and set the box down, and began working through the files. And she did all of this with her face arranged in the expression of a person who has been running a routine errand. Inside, she was running the conversation back through her mind at full speed. She had already known she was being watched. She had already known she was being assessed. She had filed the fact of her own visibility carefully. But hearing Elder Graves use the word useful and use the word role, moved her understanding from abstract to immediate. He was not simply trying to convert her. He was trying to recruit her. She was a resource he was cultivating. Her capacity for correspondence work, her attention to detail, her apparent emotional progress in the evening group. These were not just signs of her adjustment. They were her value proposition. He was building her toward a position inside the structure, one of the hands or something adjacent, a role that would extend his reach and deepen the system's function. And Warren had said something that stopped in her mind like a caught thread. I am not certain whether that is depth or performance. Warren had doubted. Warren had not said she was convincing. He had said he was uncertain. She needed to know more about Warren. She needed to know where Warren's uncertainty came from, and whether it was the kind of uncertainty that could become something. She also needed to think about what this information changed in her plan. She had been moving carefully toward the vault, waiting for the right conditions, building the picture of who else was aware. Now she understood that the timeline was not entirely her own. Elder Graves had a timeline for her, and his timeline involved placing her in a role that would integrate her more deeply, give her more access but also more visibility, make her more useful to him, and simultaneously harder to extract from the system. She had to move before that happened, not urgently. Urgency was the thing she could not afford, but with more intention about pace. In the evening group that night, Audrey walked them through an exercise about releasing what she called the inherited story. The idea was that the identities people brought into the circle had been formed by circumstances and influences outside their control, and that real growth required identifying those influences and consciously releasing them, choosing, deliberately, who you were going to be, rather than continuing to be who circumstance had made you. Nora participated. She was articulate about her inherited story. She identified, correctly, that she had learned to observe rather than express, from growing up in a household where expression was either irrelevant or impossible. She framed this, for Audrey's purposes, as a limitation to be released. She did not say that it was also the tool she was using to survive this place. She did not say that observation was not a limitation she had inherited, but a capacity she had built, and that she had no intention of releasing it, and that the invitation to release it was the most precise threat the compound had yet made to her ability to protect herself. 3 days after the corridor, she found an opportunity to be near Warren. She had been moved, temporarily, to help with a task in the main house, rearranging the storage of the circle's financial records ahead of what was described as an internal review. Warren was present, overseeing. They worked in the same room for 2 hours. She watched him with the same attention she gave everything, and what she found was this. Warren was efficient and thorough and clearly intelligent, and he had been in the circle for a very long time, and there was something in the way he moved through the compound that was just slightly different from the way the fully committed members moved. It was not doubt, exactly. It was not the pressed lips of Petra or the careful eyes of Helen. It was more like the movement of someone who has known a thing for so long that they no longer think about it, but who, if pressed, if given a real reason to think, might find that their thinking had moved in directions they had not acknowledged. She did not approach him. She would never approach someone senior with a direct conversation. That was not how it worked. But she made a small error, deliberately. While moving a set of files, she placed 2 folders in a section that any careful eye would know was incorrect, based on the system she had been shown. Then she corrected it herself, out loud, noting her mistake in the tone of someone genuinely checking her own work. Warren looked up. He said nothing. but he watched her correct the files, and when she looked up briefly, his expression was not the expression of someone observing a subordinate's minor error. It was the expression of someone cataloging something useful. She went back to the evening group. She went back to the correspondence room. She kept building her picture. Helen told her, in the candle corridor 2 weeks after the administrative corridor incident, that she had been noticed spending more time in the administrative block. Not suspiciously, Helen said. She was being sent there on legitimate tasks, but the hands tracked patterns, and spending time near Elder Graves's operational center was a pattern. It is not yet concerning to them, Helen said. You are new enough that the tasks can be explained, but you should know it is being noted. Nora nodded. I know. There is something else. Helen set down her clipboard, which was the thing she did, when what she was about to say needed her full attention. I have been here 11 years, and I have seen people try to access the vault before. Twice. Both times, the attempt came from someone who had been pushed by anger or desperation. Both times, it was noticed before it succeeded. She looked at Nora steadily. This is not discouragement. I am telling you, so you know why anger and desperation are not the fuel for this. I am not angry, Nora said. I know. Helen picked up her clipboard. That is why I am still talking to you. The third poison was administered in her 6th month, and this one she had not fully anticipated. She had expected the continued shaping of her relationship to her father. She had expected the deepening of the circle's vocabulary in her daily thought. She had been watching for both, holding them at a distance. What she had not expected was the complicity. It came through the correspondence work. One morning she was asked, for the first time, not to summarize an incoming letter but to draft a response. The letter was from a woman named Dorothy, a mother, clearly, a worried one, whose daughter had been at the compound for nearly 2 years, and whom Dorothy had not seen or spoken to directly in 4 months. The letter was careful and sad and real. It said that the daughter had stopped being responsive to her letters. It said she was frightened. It said, very quietly, at the end, that she sometimes wondered if she would see her daughter again. The task, given to Nora, was to draft Elder Graves's response. She was given the template, the tone, the reassurances, the language used to calm outside families. She was given, alongside it, the summary of the daughter's recent progress reports from Audrey. The daughter was doing well in the circle's terms. She had aligned deeply. She no longer reached outward toward family, not because she had been told not to, but because the teaching had reshaped her felt experience of those connections. Nora sat with the blank paper and the worried mother's letter, and the template and the progress report. She wrote the response. She used the template's tone. She used the circle's vocabulary. She said the daughter was flourishing. She said the community was like a second family. She said Dorothy could rest easy. She folded it. She put it in the outgoing pile. She did not look at it again. That evening, she went to the window in her room and stood there for a long time, and she felt, for the first time since she had arrived, something that was not fear, and not calculation, and not the steady hum of resistance. She felt the specific shame of having told a frightened mother, a managed half-truth, on behalf of a man who kept records in a locked room, and moved people through a system, like products on a line. She stood with this. She did not flinch from it. She named it, I am now inside this, not as a prisoner, as a functioning part. She understood what this was for. She understood that the compound made you useful before it made you loyal, because usefulness was a faster path to complicity than persuasion. Once you had written Dorothy's letter, once you had put it in the outgoing pile and walked away, you had a stake in the system. A small one, but a stake. She also understood that understanding this did not undo the letter. Dorothy had received a response that kept her from acting on her fear. Because of Nora's careful hand, a frightened woman would wait another month, 2 months, before trying something different, and in those months, the daughter would move further along the path she was on. She had done this. She held the fact of it. And she thought, you are angry now. And Helen is right that anger is not the fuel. But this is different from anger. This is the shape of what has to be undone, and it is clearer than anything else I have seen here, and I am going to hold it exactly as it is, and not let it become anything smaller. She was ready to move. She thought about Dorothy that night for a long time. Dorothy had a return address in the upper left corner of her letter, a street name, and a number in a town 20 miles from the compound. Nora had not memorized it at the time because there had been no reason to. She had been summarizing incoming letters, not planning to use the contact information. But the name had lodged anyway, because Nora's memory logged details without her consciously telling it to. Dorothy's daughter was named Clara. Clara had been at the compound for nearly 2 years. In the correspondence records, Clara was described, in the summaries that reached Elder Graves, as integrated and purposeful and content. In the actual letters from Dorothy, Clara was a daughter who had stopped calling, stopped writing in her own words, stopped being present in the small, specific ways that mothers notice. The particular turn of phrase, the private reference, the reference to a shared memory. Clara's last direct letter to Dorothy, which was the one Clara had written herself before the correspondence became managed, had been 15 months ago. Nora had now helped manage that correspondence for 3 months. She had contributed, with her careful handwriting and her adherence to the template, to the continued distance between Dorothy and Clara. She held this fact cleanly. She did not soften it with the argument that the alternative, refusing the task, would have ended her ability to work in the correspondence room and removed her access to the information she needed. That might be true. It was also true that Dorothy had waited another month because of the letter Nora had written, and the truth of one thing did not cancel the truth of another. She thought about all the Dorothys. She had now processed a full month of incoming correspondence, and the letters from outside were not the exception. They were a regular stream. Families waiting, partners waiting, friends who were confused by the changed behavior of people they had known before the circle. All of them receiving managed responses. All of them being given a version of the situation that kept them calm and waiting, rather than alarmed and acting. The correspondence room was, she now understood, not just a communication system. It was a pressure release valve. By maintaining a steady outward stream of reassuring information, it prevented the outside world from generating enough alarm to produce intervention. The families did not push harder because they received enough contact to conclude that their person was fine. They worried, some of them, but they worried quietly, waiting for the next letter, hoping for a phone call that never quite materialized, accepting the explanation that the lifestyle was simply different and the contact was simply less frequent. If the correspondence room stopped functioning, if the families stopped receiving managed responses, the pressure would build within months. The Dorothys of the world would not wait indefinitely. They would act. They would call officials. They would drive to the gate. They would make noise that could not be absorbed by a carefully worded letter. She thought about this as a mechanism. She thought about what it would mean, in combination with the documents from the vault, to put the real correspondence in front of the right people, not just the arrangement records. The actual letters. The original worried letters from outside, alongside the managed responses sent in their place. The contrast between what the families were feeling and what Elder Graves's system was telling them would be, all on its own, a form of evidence that required no interpretation. She was not ready to act, not yet, but she was ready to be ready, which was the stage just before the stage that counted. She went to sleep that night holding the shape of what needed to happen, turning it over like something she was checking for flaws, finding none that could not be planned around. She was 6 months in. She had been in the compound long enough that her absence from a public event would be noticed, and her presence was now reliable enough to be expected. That was both a risk and a resource, and she was going to have to use it carefully. She was not afraid. She was, for the first time since she had arrived, something closer to ready than not. The vault key was not where she expected it to be. Nothing in this place was. She had spent 2 weeks in careful preparation, and in those 2 weeks, she had developed a theory of the key, that it was either on Doris's ring, which Doris kept at her hip during the day and hung on a hook inside her private room at night, or in Elder Graves's office, on the ring he kept in his desk drawer when he was in the building, and in his jacket pocket when he was not. She had built a plan around acquiring access to one of these keys on the night of the first Sunday dinner, when the administrative block would be empty. She had also built contingencies for the plan failing. She had also built a third option that did not require a key at all, which she returned to when the first 2 options collapsed, not because of anything she did wrong, but because of something she learned the day before the Sunday dinner. She learned it from Warren. Warren, who she had been watching carefully since the administrative corridor, found her in the correspondence room on a Saturday morning and asked her to carry a message to Elder Graves's office. This was not unusual. Members were regularly used as messengers for small internal tasks. She took the sealed envelope and walked to the administrative block and knocked on the office door and was told to come in. Elder Graves was at his desk. The office was smaller than she had imagined, plain, efficient, no decoration except the word alignment printed on a card that sat in a small frame on the corner of the desk. He was writing when she came in, and he did not immediately look up. She had a few seconds to look at the room. The desk had no drawer visible from where she stood. The wall to her left had a cabinet, closed, with a combination lock. The wall behind the desk had a door. She had not known about this door, because the administrative block's interior was not visible from outside, and she had been working from floor plan logic rather than direct knowledge. The door was closed, but not locked, and through the gap at the bottom, she could see that it opened onto a passage rather than another room. Elder Graves looked up. She handed him the envelope. He said thank you. She left. In the corridor, she adjusted. There was a passage behind the office. The vault was described as a room at the back of the administrative block, and a passage behind the office would lead toward the back of the block. She needed to revise her understanding of the layout. She was thinking about this on Saturday afternoon when Warren came to her again, this time not with a message, but with something she had not expected, and for which she was not, entirely, prepared. He found her walking the covered walkway between the east building and the gathering hall. He walked alongside her for a few steps, not speaking, in the way that some people at the compound initiated conversations. Parallel motion first, words second, a technique that felt casual but was deliberate. Then he said, quietly and without preamble, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to receive it carefully." She kept walking. She kept her pace. "All right," she said. "Elder Graves is going to invite you to join the hands," Warren said. "Not immediately. He will take another month or two to make certain, but the decision is essentially made." She said nothing. "I am telling you, because I was once invited to join the hands," Warren continued. "And when I was, no one told me what it would actually mean. I was shown what I would gain, and I made a decision without complete information, and I have been living in that decision for 9 years." He paused. His voice was even, but she could hear the thing underneath it, the thing that 9 years of not acknowledging had compressed into a kind of density. "I am not going to tell you to refuse. I am not in a position to tell you what to do. But I am going to tell you that once you are inside the inner structure, the things you know become your responsibility in a different way, and things you know, but cannot act on, become very heavy." She measured everything about this. She measured the risk of responding honestly, and the risk of responding with the compound's language, and the risk of saying nothing. She said, "What things do you know, Warren?" A long pause. They had reached the end of the covered walkway, where it opened to the garden. He stopped. She stopped. He looked at the pear tree at the far end of the garden, the one that had been heavy with fruit when she arrived and was now bare, with the winter coming. "There are records in the administrative block," he said, "that document the financial arrangements made for each person who enters through that gate. Every person who has been brought here over the past 30 years. The arrangements vary. Some people came of their own will, genuinely seeking something. But many, more than you would expect, were brought through agreements with family members or associates who received something in return." He looked at the tree. "I have seen those records. I was shown them, years ago, when Elder Graves was demonstrating to me the scope and seriousness of the community. He showed me the records as evidence of how much the circle had grown and how many lives had been touched. He believed the records were evidence of success. I received them that way." He paused. "I do not receive them that way now." She waited. The garden was cold and still. "The record room is not accessible without the passkey," Warren said. "The passkey is not a physical key. It is a code. The code is changed quarterly. I know the current code because the hands are informed of it in case of emergency. The code is 6 numbers." He told her the code. He said it once, quietly, and did not repeat it. She received it without visibly responding. She held it perfectly in her mind. "The room is behind Elder Graves's office," Warren said. "There is a passage. At the end of the passage, a keypad on the left. The door is metal, looks like a storage door. It is not. Inside there are 5 filing cabinets and a desk, and a safe in the corner that I do not have the combination to." He turned from the pear tree and looked at her steadily. "I am not asking you to do anything with this. I am giving it to you because it should exist with someone who will use it correctly. She held his gaze. Why me? Because, he said, for 8 months I have been watching you process the compound the way someone processes evidence rather than experience. You observe without reacting. You learn without appearing to. You are the only person I have seen come through that gate, in 9 years, who looks like they are solving a problem rather than living inside one. He paused. I am tired, and I am not brave enough for what might be required, and I am sorry for that. But I can give you the code, she said, very quietly. Thank you. Warren walked back down the covered walkway without looking back. She stood in the cold garden for a moment, in the space where the conversation had been. She thought about Warren's 9 years. She thought about the weight he had described, knowing things you cannot act on. She thought about how long he had been carrying the code and waiting for someone to give it to. Then she stopped thinking about Warren and started thinking about Sunday. The first Sunday dinner ran from 4 in the afternoon until at least 9 in the evening. She knew this from the correspondence room schedule, which tracked the hands' availability. During that window, the administrative block would be empty. Doris attended the dinner because Doris was a senior member. The hands attended. The senior women attended. The building would be unoccupied. She had one problem. She could not simply be absent from the dinner without explanation. Attendance at the Sunday monthly dinner was expected of all community members above the entering stage. She was no longer technically in the entering stage. She had been formally moved to general membership in her 4th month. She was expected to be at the table. She spent Saturday evening and Sunday morning thinking through every variation. She needed a reason to leave the dinner that was not suspicious. An illness would work, but would bring attention, and potentially Doris, who would want to manage it. A task would need to be assigned by someone with authority, which required involving someone else. She needed something that required no witness, no management, no attention. She thought about Frances. Frances, who poured tea without being asked, was one of the compound's oldest members. She was 70 and moved slowly, and had, in the past weeks, been having difficulty with her joints. She was not always able to attend the Sunday dinners. She was usually given a meal tray in her room, and a member was occasionally asked to check on her. On Sunday morning, Nora found Frances in the common room and sat with her and asked how she was feeling. Nora said she was sorry, and she meant it, and she said that she would bring Frances a tray that evening so she did not have to navigate the dining hall steps. Frances thanked her. Nora went to Doris before the dinner and said she would be taking a tray to Frances and would join the dinner shortly after. Doris said that was thoughtful. Doris did not check the timing carefully because Doris was managing 40 things on Sunday dinner day. At 4:15, when the dinner guests had gathered, Nora took a tray to Frances. She sat with Frances for 15 minutes, genuinely, without hurry, because Frances was real, and the care was real, even when the timing was strategic. Frances ate and talked about her garden, and Nora listened. At 4:30, she left Frances's room. She walked, not hurried, to the administrative block. The building was dark. The door was unlocked, because the building was not supposed to require locking when the hands were in residence in the compound. She went inside. The corridor was exactly as she had walked it many times. She passed the correspondence room, dark and empty. She passed the supply room. She reached the door to Elder Graves's office. She went in. The passage behind the office was to the right, through the door she had seen from across the room a week ago. She went through it. The passage was short, 10 feet, plain walls, a single light overhead that she did not turn on, because the light from the office was sufficient, and she did not want an additional light visible under the outer door. At the end of the passage, on the left wall, was the keypad, small, gray, unremarkable. She entered the code Warren had given her. 6 numbers. The keypad accepted it with a small click, and the door, which looked like storage but was not, swung open. She went in. The room was cold and smelled of paper and something metallic from the safe in the corner. 5 filing cabinets, exactly as Warren had said, a desk in the center with a lamp on it. She turned the lamp on. The room had no window. The light was safe. She went to the first cabinet. It was not locked. She opened the drawer. Files. Each labeled with a name and a date. She read quickly, scanning. Names she recognized from the correspondence room, dates going back decades, and inside each file, what she found was exactly what Warren had described, but denser, more specific. not just financial records. Complete documentation, the name and contact information of whoever had arranged the person's entry, the nature of the arrangement, the terms, the amount exchanged, and in many files, correspondence between Elder Graves and the arranging party that discussed the person themselves, their perceived characteristics, their vulnerabilities, their potential usefulness, their expected integration timeline. She found Bet's file. She found Cora's file. She found Petra's. She found her own. Her file was in the third cabinet. Gerald Calloway's name was on the arrangement documentation, the amount he had received. The letter Elder Graves had written to him on the day she arrived, reporting that she had settled in well. A note from Audrey, dated 3 months in, describing her as high potential, careful, contains more than she shows, recommend extended development track. A note from Elder Graves himself, handwritten, which said, "The Calloway girl is the most interesting arrival in 5 years. Do not rush her. She will be worth the investment." She read this and stood very still for a moment. Then she moved. She was not here simply to read. She had known, before she came, that she could not take documents without their absence being noticed. She had planned for a different kind of taking. She had, in her pocket, 4 folded sheets of blank paper that she had taken from the supply room 2 weeks ago, one at a time, not enough to notice. She had a pen. She sat down at the desk and she began copying, not everything, the key things, the names and dates from the arrangement files of the people currently in the compound, her own files arrangement details, the letters, the financial figures. She wrote in small, tight handwriting, the way she had learned to write when taking notes she needed to keep private, fitting more on a page than seemed possible. She wrote for 25 minutes. She heard no sound from outside the room. She wrote until she had the most critical information, the things that could not be reconstructed from memory alone, the things that would need to exist on paper in someone else's hands to have any power. Then she returned the files exactly to their positions. She checked the desk surface. She turned off the lamp. She let the door close behind her and heard the keypad reset. She walked back through the passage, through the office, down the corridor, out of the administrative block. She walked at the pace of someone returning from an errand. She went to the dining hall and took her place at the dinner table and said she was sorry she was late and helped herself to the food. And around her, the hands and the senior members and the community ate and talked and the candles on the tables burned steadily, and she kept her face exactly as it needed to be. Under her left hand, folded into quarters in the pocket of her dress, was everything she had come to find. She ate. She talked when spoken to. She listened to Elder Graves speak about the circle of the year and the meaning of the coming season, and she watched his slow blinking eyes move across the room and pause, for a moment, on her face. She held his gaze. She did not look away. She gave him the expression she had been giving him for 7 months, the expression of someone who was still finding their way, still moving toward something, still arriving. He smiled at her, the smile of someone who believed they had correctly identified what they were looking at. She smiled back. She stayed at the dinner until 9:15, which was when it began to break up in the natural way that events break up. Gradually, then all at once. She helped clear the cups from the table, because that was a thing she would ordinarily do, and then she went back to the East Wing with a group of women including Caroline, and she said goodnight and went to her bed. She lay on her back with the folded papers against her side and stared at the ceiling for a long time. She ran through what she had copied, testing her memory of it against the written record she now possessed. The two matched. She had not missed anything significant. The most important names were on the paper. The financial figures were on the paper. The correspondence extracts were on the paper. Elder Graves's own handwritten note about her was on the paper. In his handwriting, in the document that bore the date and the context that would make it legible to an outside authority. She thought about Warren. She thought about him finishing his dinner and walking back to his room, and knowing, approximately, what had happened tonight while he was eating. He would know, because he had given her the code. He would know, because the Sunday dinner was the window he would have selected himself, if he had been the one making the plan. He would not say anything. He would not report anything. He would return to his 9 years of carrying what he carried, except now the weight would be slightly different, because some of it had been transferred. She found, thinking about this, that she was grateful, not in the performance sense, in the real sense. He had done a thing that cost him something, and he had done it without requiring anything of her in return, without even allowing himself to be visible in it, and that kind of act was not nothing. It was a kind of courage that required the person performing it to remain invisible, which was the hardest kind. She thought about Helen. She thought about the 11 years. She thought about the small things in poor soil. She thought about her father, sleeping in the house 2 counties over, with the debt cleared in the quiet rooms, and the letters from Elder Graves that told him his daughter was doing well. She thought, I am doing well, just not in the direction you think. She closed her eyes. She let herself sleep, because rest was a resource, and tomorrow she was going to need every resource she had. She kept the papers where they were, against her side, under the blanket. When she woke at 5:30, they were still there. The compound woke around her in its familiar pattern, the morning sounds, the movement, the smell of bread coming from the kitchen. She got up. She went to the window. She stood there for 30 seconds, looking at the garden. The pear tree had 1 fruit left on its branches, overlooked in the harvest. A single pear, small and slightly crooked, holding on in the November cold. She looked at it for all 30 seconds. Then she turned from the window and began her day. She had the papers. She had the code. She had Petra. She had the memory of 41 names. She had the specific determination of a person who had understood, from the inside, everything that was being done to her and to the people around her, and who had decided, long before this morning, that understanding it completely was not the end of the task. It was only the beginning of being ready to act on it. She had the documents. She also had no way to get them out. This was the part she had not fully solved before she accessed the vault, and she had known it was not fully solved, and she had gone in anyway because the code was time-sensitive. Warren had said it was changed quarterly, which meant she had at most a few weeks before the code she had been given was replaced, and because waiting for a complete plan in a place that was actively building a role for her was a luxury she could not afford. Now she had 4 sheets of densely written paper in a pocket, and she had the problem of distance. She thought about this problem for 3 days, in the way she thought about all problems, quietly, incrementally, from multiple directions. The physical leaving was not the hardest part. Members left the compound for legitimate reasons regularly, to deliver goods to market buyers, to attend the quarterly gatherings in outside venues, to accompany Elder Graves or the hands-on occasional trips. She had not yet been included in any of these outside activities, but they existed, and they were the clearest path. The harder parts were 2. Who was going with her if she went, and what happened to the people left behind? She could leave alone. She had thought about this many times. She could find a legitimate outside trip, keep the papers, make contact when she was out, present the documentation to someone who could act on it. She could be out in a day, if the circumstances aligned. But she kept returning to Petra's pressed lips. She kept returning to the 41 names she had memorized from the correspondence room. She kept returning to Dorothy's letter, and the response she had written on Elder Graves's behalf, the one that had asked a frightened mother to wait a little longer. She could leave alone, but if she left alone, the compound would continue. Elder Graves would not be stopped by one person's departure, even with documentation. The documentation needed to reach people who could act on it, and it needed to reach them with enough specificity and volume to make a response impossible to defer or dismiss. One person leaving was an anecdote. One person leaving with records and a list of family contacts and a witness was different. She needed one other person who was ready. She had been thinking, carefully, about who that person was, and she had arrived at a conclusion she had been reluctant to reach, because it involved a risk she could not calculate. The person she needed was not Helen, who was too visible and too tired, and too invested in her own careful survival. The person she needed was not Warren, who had given her the code, and was carrying his 9 years, and was not going to do more than he had already done. The person was Petra. Petra, who still braided cord. Petra, who still pressed her lips together. Petra, who had asked to write her own letter to her sister, and had been told the timing was not right. Petra, who was at the compound's crossroads, still in conflict, not yet past it, which meant she could still be reached. She waited for the right moment. Not urgency, not pressure, the right moment. She had learned, from 8 months of watching the compound, that the most important things happened sideways, never head-on, never in the spaces designed for direct conversation. The right moment came on a Wednesday evening when the compound had a power interruption, brief, 20 minutes, caused by a fault in the external connection. and the gathering was postponed, and members dispersed to their rooms or the common area, and there was, for once, unscheduled time. Unscheduled time was rare enough that people did not know what to do with it, and they gathered in small clusters and talked about nothing important, which was exactly the kind of conversation in which something important could be hidden. She was in their room with Petra. Caroline was not there. She had gone to the common area with Doris. Nora sat on her bed and looked at the ceiling for a few minutes, and then she said, in the same quiet voice Petra had used the night she mentioned her sister, "My father doesn't know the truth of what is here." Petra looked up from the cord in her hands. "He was told things about this place that were not accurate," Nora continued. She spoke slowly, with care, without looking at Petra, keeping her eyes on the ceiling. "I have seen the documents. I know the terms of the arrangement that brought me here. The arrangement was not what he was told it was." Silence. She could hear Petra's breathing. "I also know," Nora said, still to the ceiling, "that the arrangement that brought you here was similar. I have seen your file. I know what was said to your family to explain your coming here." Petra did not speak, but she had stopped braiding. "I am not saying this to frighten you," Nora said. "I am saying it because you are going to have to decide something very soon. The evening group is going to push you past the place where you still feel your sister as a living reality in your life, rather than a connection you have moved beyond. I have watched it happen to Bet. I know what it looks like. You are very close to that line." More silence. Then Petra, very quietly,
"What did you see in my file?"
"I saw that your family was told you came here voluntarily, at your own initiative, seeking community. That is not what the arrangement document says." Petra's hands were still in her lap. "How did you get into the file room? That is less important than what we do with what I found." A long, slow breath from Petra. "What do we do with what you found?" Nora turned her head and looked at Petra directly for the first time in the conversation. Petra's face was not the face of the performing member of the evening group. It was the face from the pressed lips, the face from the quiet voice, the face Nora had been waiting to be looking at for this conversation. "There is a market delivery scheduled in 11 days, Nora said. "The candle and basket delivery to the county market. It goes by truck. 2 members usually accompany the goods. I am going to ask to be one of them. I need you to ask to be the other." Petra stared at her. And then we do not come back." The silence this time was different. It was the silence of something being weighed. Not quickly, not on a surface level, but deep, in the part of a person where the real decisions are made. Nora could see it happening. She did not rush it. She had not rushed anything in 8 months, and she was not going to rush this. "My sister," Petra said. Her voice was very low. "I have her contact information. From the correspondence room. She has written 3 letters this year." Nora paused. "I have them memorized." Petra closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were different. Not tearful. Clear. The kind of clear that comes after a very long time of not allowing yourself to see something. "I will ask about the market delivery tomorrow," Petra said. The 11 days between that conversation and the morning of the market delivery were the hardest 11 days Nora had spent in the compound. Not because anything went wrong, because nothing went wrong, and the waiting in that condition was its own particular difficulty. She continued to work. She continued to attend the evening group. She continued to perform the surface that had been performing itself for 8 months. She noticed, during those 11 days, how automatic the performance had become, how little conscious effort it now required to say the right things with the right expressions, and how unsettling this was when she noticed it. She understood, for the first time, why Helen had been in the compound for 11 years. Not because she lacked the will or the means to leave, but because the cost of constant performance, paid over enough time, becomes a kind of currency that buys a certain safety, and a person who has built their safety on a particular currency can become, without intending to, afraid of what it would mean to stop spending it. The compound did not just change your beliefs, it changed your sense of what was safe, and eventually, for many people, staying became less frightening than leaving, not because they loved the place, but because the self they had been outside the compound felt too far away to find. She carried this understanding. It deepened her purpose. Audrey, in their penultimate private meeting before the delivery day, told her that Elder Graves had something important he wanted to discuss with her soon. She said it with the energy of someone delivering good news. She said his word was distinction, that he saw distinction in Nora, that he wanted to speak with her about a path forward in the community. Nora said she was grateful and looked forward to it. She performed gratitude so well in that moment that Audrey reached out and briefly touched her hand and said she was proud of the work Nora had done. Nora said thank you. She felt the small, real weight of the part of Audrey that was genuine, and she held it alongside the clarity of what needed to happen. On the morning of the delivery, the truck came at 7. The compound's goods were loaded: boxes of candles, baskets, jars of preserved fruit. Nora and Petra were there, with heavy coats against the October chill, and Owen was driving, which was a complication she had factored into the plan. Owen was not a hand, not a senior member, but he was loyal, in the uncomplicated way of people who have grown up inside a system and have no framework outside it. He was going to be the problem. The market was 45 minutes away. The plan required that Owen be separated from them long enough for them to reach a phone. What actually happened was simpler than she had planned, which she would later reflect was often the case when you had prepared for complexity. The simpler version had been there all along, but only became visible close up. Owen parked the truck at the market, which was an outdoor county market with dozens of vendors and hundreds of people, and the three of them began unloading the goods onto the reserved stall. 15 minutes in, a man at an adjacent stall had a disagreement with his neighbor over the boundary of their spaces, and it escalated in the way market disputes sometimes do, loudly, with an audience forming. Owen, who handled the circle's market relations and was always alert to anything that might reflect on the community's reputation at the market, went to manage the situation and to make clear that the circle was not involved. He told them he would be back shortly. He walked 20 feet away. Nora looked at Petra. Petra looked at Nora. They walked in the other direction. She had memorized the market layout on paper from the correspondence files, which mentioned the market by name in multiple letters. She knew there was a row of businesses behind the market's north edge. She knew one of them was a pharmacy with a public telephone. They walked. They did not run. Running drew eyes. They walked through the crowd, two women in the middle of a Tuesday morning county market, and they reached the pharmacy, and Nora went to the phone and dialed the number she had memorized. Not her father, not yet, because her father was the wrong first call. She dialed the number of the county social services office, which she had also memorized from the correspondence records, because the circle had been in contact with that office 3 years ago, regarding a matter that had been smoothly managed at the time, and she had noted the number then. She told the person who answered her name. She said she was calling from the county market. She said she had documentation of financial arrangements made for the involuntary entry of multiple individuals into a residential community, and that she needed to speak with someone immediately, and that she and another person needed to be picked up from the pharmacy at the north edge of the market before they were found. The person on the line was a woman named Kay, and Kay said, "Stay where you are. Do not leave the building. I am sending someone now." Nora said thank you. She hung up. She turned to Petra, who was standing beside her, very pale, very still, with the look of someone who has just done the bravest thing they have ever done, and is waiting to find out if it was real. "Someone is coming," Nora said. Petra pressed her lips together. Then she stopped pressing them. She let out a breath that had been held, it seemed, for months. They waited inside the pharmacy, in the aisle between vitamins and cold remedies, and neither of them spoke for a while. And outside through the window they could see the market going on, ordinary and loud and alive, and beyond it the street, which led to other streets, which led to the county in every direction, and none of it was theirs yet, and all of it was about to be. Ellen drove them, not in a county vehicle but in a plain car that did not identify itself, and this was a consideration Nora had not asked for, and was grateful for anyway, because a county vehicle outside a pharmacy near a county market at 4:30 in the afternoon would have been visible, and visible was the one thing she could not afford for the next few hours. She rode in the back seat with Petra, and Petra did not speak for the first 15 minutes. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked out the window at the county roads passing, the fields, the houses, the ordinary November afternoon of a world that had been going on without them for 8 months. Nora watched Petra watch it, and thought about the specific quality of seeing the outside after a long absence. How familiar it was, and how strange. How it registered simultaneously as the world you already knew, and as something you were encountering for the first time, from a new angle. Because you were different, and the difference reframed the familiar. She had prepared for many things. She had prepared for Owen discovering them gone, which he had by now. She had prepared for the official process, which Ellen was already navigating from the front seat, making calls in a low voice. She had prepared, in the back of her mind, for the possibility that the documentation she had copied would be disputed or insufficient, and she had prepared the secondary argument, which was the testimony from Warren, combined with the correspondence records she had in her memory. She had not fully prepared for how quiet Petra would be, for the quality of that quiet, which was not the performing quiet of the compound, the measured silence of someone managing their expressions, but a different kind entirely, the quiet of someone sitting still, inside a very large feeling. "Are you all right?" Nora said. Petra turned from the window. Her eyes were wet, but her face was not collapsed. "I don't know what I am," she said. "I think I am all right. I think I am going to need some time to know what I am." "That's true," Nora said. "That's the right answer." Petra looked at her. "Were you afraid, in there, when you went to that room?" Nora thought about this honestly. "Not the way I expected to be. I was very focused. The fear was underneath the focus. I could feel it, but it wasn't in my way." Petra nodded, slowly. "I was afraid this morning, the whole time we were unloading the truck. I kept thinking I could not do it, that my legs would not move in the right direction. But they did. They did." Petra looked at her hands. "You knew they would." "I didn't know," Nora said. "I believed they would. That's different. I believed it because I watched you for months, and what I saw was someone who still knew what was real, someone who still felt the people outside as real." She paused. "That is what makes people move when the moment comes, not bravery, not planning, just the reality of the real thing being more insistent than the fear." Petra was quiet again. Then, "My sister's name is Annette." "I know," Nora said. Ellen pulled into the county office parking lot. The fluorescent lights of the building were visible through the dusk. They got out. They walked in together, two women in heavy coats, carrying nothing except what they had been carrying inside them for months, and the doors opened, and they went through. The woman from social services arrived in 19 minutes. She was not what Nora had imagined. She was young, perhaps 29, with a practical coat and a calm face that suggested she had managed difficult situations before, without requiring drama to navigate them. Her name was Ellen, and she had a partner with her named Greg, who was heavier and quieter, and who stood by the pharmacy door, while Ellen sat across from Nora and Petra in the waiting area and listened. Nora told her in order. Not everything at once. She had thought about this, about the sequence, about what needed to be established first, for the rest to be taken seriously. She told Ellen her name and age, and the date she had arrived at the compound. She told her the nature of the arrangement that had brought her there. She showed Ellen the 4 folded sheets of paper she had kept in the pocket of her dress for 11 days. She watched Ellen read them, saw Ellen's expression not change but compress, the way a face compresses when it is taking something in, and not allowing itself to react prematurely. Ellen asked questions. They were good questions, specific and procedural, the kind that established timelines and relationships rather than emotion. Nora answered all of them. She did not embellish. She did not interpret. She gave Ellen the facts with the dates and the names and the specific details that she had been carrying in her memory for months, and she gave them cleanly, without anger, without the trembling voice that might have been expected from a teenager who had been in a closed community for 8 months. This steadiness would be noted, she knew. People expected distress, and its absence could read as performance. But she also knew she could not manufacture a distress she did not feel in that particular moment, because the overwhelming thing she felt, sitting in the pharmacy, was not distress. It was the feeling of something long held finally being placed on a table in front of another person. Petra told her own part of it, shorter, less detailed, with a voice that was slightly unsteady, but a face that was clear. She gave her sister's name. Ellen wrote it down. Greg, from the door, said, "We should move before the driver from the market comes looking." Ellen nodded. She looked at Nora. "I want to be direct with you. I believe what you are telling me. The documents you have support your account. But the process from here involves several steps, and not all of them are fast. The most immediate step is getting you somewhere safe. The compound will know you are gone soon if they do not already." She paused. "Is there anyone inside the compound who is at risk because of what you have done?" Nora thought about this carefully. She thought about Warren. "There is a man named Warren," she said. He is one of the hands. He gave me access to the room where the documents are kept. He did not come with me. He is still inside. Ellen looked at Greg. Something passed between them. We will need to know more about Warren, Ellen said, and we will need to move carefully with regard to him, because if the community connects your departure to him, before we are able to act, his position becomes difficult. I know, Nora said. She had thought about Warren constantly in the 11 days. She had thought about what it would cost him when she left, and whether giving her the code had been, at some level, his own form of leaving. A proxy act, the thing he could do in place of the thing he could not. He is the one who knew I would use it correctly. He said that. His word. Ellen said she understood. She said they needed to go. They left the pharmacy through the back, because the front faced the market, and Greg drove them to a county office building, where they were brought into a conference room and given cups of tea, and told that things were going to be handled carefully and systematically. The official process was slower than Nora's internal one. In the first 48 hours, she gave a full recorded account to 2 additional officials and a woman named Barbara, who was introduced as a specialist in institutional situations involving community groups, which was a term designed to be precise without being alarming. Barbara was thorough and did not show surprise at anything Nora described, which told Nora that the circle was not the first situation of this kind Barbara had encountered. Barbara asked about Elder Graves's history, about the length of the community's operation, about the network of outside supporters, and the financial structure. Nora gave her the information from the documents and the information from memory, and Barbara received all of it with the kind of focused attention that made the months of watching and counting feel, for the first time, purposeful, in a way that extended beyond Nora's own survival. Petra, in an adjoining room, was speaking to different officials, and at some point during that first day, she was connected by telephone to her sister. Nora heard, through the thin wall between rooms, the sound of Petra saying her sister's name. Not a word, not a sentence, just the name, in a voice that was neither loud nor soft, but was the most honest sound Nora had heard in 8 months. She called her father on the second day. She had thought about this call more than almost anything else. She had thought about it in the 11 days before leaving, and she had thought about it in the pharmacy, and she had thought about it during the long first day of accounts and documentation. She had decided, during all that thinking, what she would not do. She would not perform the version of hurt that had been shaped by Audrey's careful questions. She would not give her father a story that was clean in one direction. She had spent months resisting the compound's effort to flatten the account of her father into a useful narrative, and she was not going to replace that narrative with a different flat one just because this one would be hers. Ellen dialed for her and gave her the phone and left the room. It rang twice. Then her father's voice, which was the voice of a man who answered the phone the way he did everything, with a weight at the back of it, a prepared readiness for more bad news. She said, "Dad, it's Nora." The silence on the line was not empty. It was full of things. She could hear them, the way you hear something large, moving in water, even when you can't see it. Then he said her name, and his voice broke on it, and she understood something she had not fully understood before, which was that her father had not known. He had believed what he was told. He had signed the papers believing he was giving her something better, and in the months since, in the quiet house with the lights on, and the hardware business failed, and the hardware business's debt cleared, and the letters from Elder Graves that reported her progress, he had been doing the thing that people who have done something irreversible do. He had been constructing and reconstructing a version of events in which the irreversible thing had been right. "I am out," she said. "I am safe. I need to talk to you about some things, and some of them are going to be very hard to hear, and I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything." He said, "Okay." She told him about the arrangement document, what his name was on, what the terms actually said, as opposed to what he had been told. She told him about the financial record. She told him about the letters that Elder Graves had sent him, which had been managed communications rather than honest reports. She told him all of this in even language, without accusation, but without softening, because she had decided that he deserved the truth, and so did she. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he said, in a voice that was very small for a man who was not small, "I thought it was a good place." "I know," she said. "That is the part that I believe, and it is also not the whole story." More silence. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to come," she said. I need you to be willing to give a statement to the people who are handling this. The document with your name on it is evidence. Your account of what you were told is evidence. I cannot do what needs to be done here without you being a part of it. Her father said he would come. He said he was leaving right now. He said he was sorry, and he said it 3 times, the word growing smaller and more weighted each time. And she let him say it, and did not respond to it, because she had decided that what the word deserved was not absolution, and not rejection, but simply to be received, heard, acknowledged. She received it. She told him the address. She said she would see him soon. She sat in the conference room after hanging up, and looked at her hands, which were still for the first time in a very long time. In the days that followed, the investigation moved. Barbara's office worked with the county authority, and the compound was approached first by letter and then by official visit. And Elder Graves, who had been managing situations like this for 30 years and had survived all previous approaches, encountered this one differently. Because this time, the approach came with documentation, specific and detailed, and with the names of families who were now in contact with officials, rather than waiting quietly at home for letters that came through Elder Graves's correspondence system. Warren, during the official visit to the compound, did something that no one, including Nora, had predicted. He opened the administrative block himself and showed the officials the vault. He did not do it dramatically. He did it with the same precise efficiency that was his entire manner, and he answered every question directly. And when asked why he was cooperating, he said only that he had been waiting a long time for someone to ask him the right questions. Elder Graves was not removed immediately. These things move through channels and time frames that do not match the speed of urgency. But the circle of his authority began to contract the moment the visit happened, because the network of outside supporters, the businesses, the county families, the financial contributors, was not composed primarily of people who had anything to lose from a community that functioned honestly. It was composed of people who had been given a specific impression of the community, and who, once given different information, began to reassess their associations with the speed of people who have reputations to protect. Nora was present at the second official visit, 2 weeks after leaving, as a documented witness. She walked into the compound through the front gate for the first time since the day Owen had driven her in with her 2 bags, and the walk from the gate to the administrative block was 40 steps, and she counted them, as she counted everything, and the number was the same as it had always been. She passed the garden. The pear tree was stripped of its fruit and its leaves both, standing bare in the November air, just the shape of it remaining. She looked at it as she passed. She thought about Helen's ugly garden behind the east wing, the one with the poor soil and the small things in it. She had asked Ellen, at the second day of accounts, to include Helen in the welfare check when the official visit happened. She did not know what Helen would choose to do. She thought she knew, but she had also learned, thoroughly, the difference between what she thought she knew and what was actually true, and she kept that difference clear. She did what was required of her at the second visit. She answered questions. She confirmed documentation. She kept her face exactly as she needed it to be, which, she realized as she was doing it, now meant simply as it was, because she was done performing, in any direction, and her face was just her face. She thought, walking out of the compound at the end of the visit, about the word on the wall of the gathering room, alignment, the large painted word behind the place where Elder Graves stood. She thought about what it had been designed to mean, and she thought about what it actually meant to her now, a direction, something you move toward, not agreement with someone else's framework, but the act of bringing your actions into line with what you actually know to be true, regardless of what it costs. She had been aligned, for 8 months, to a performance. She had been aligned, underneath that, to the truth of what she was watching. Those 2 things had existed simultaneously, the way 2 channels of a river run separately before they merge. They had merged now. She was only one thing. She walked out of the gate. Her father was parked on the road outside, because he had driven down for every official meeting, every session, every long day of documentation. He was standing next to the car, and he looked smaller than she remembered, and older than she remembered, and he had his hands in his coat pockets in the way he stood when he was trying to look like he was not nervous and failing. She walked toward him. She stopped 2 feet away. She looked at his face. He said, "You did something very hard." She said, "Yes." They stood there for a moment in the November cold, and the compound was behind her, and the road was ahead, and she was 18 years old, and she had been away for 8 months, and she was not. she thought. The same person who had been driven here by Owen in the white vehicle. And that was true in more than one direction. He opened the car door for her. She got in. He got in the other side. He started the engine, and the heater came on, and they sat for a moment before pulling out, and she said, "We should talk about what comes next." He said, "Yes, we should." She looked at the road. "I'm going to need a lot of things explained to me, and I'm going to need to explain a lot of things to you, and it is not going to be fast, and it is not going to be easy." "I know," he said. "But it is going to happen," she said. "All of it." He pulled out onto the road. The compound disappeared in the mirror, and she watched it go, and she did not look away until it was completely gone, and then she faced forward, and the road was just a road, and they drove. In the weeks that followed the second visit, Nora gave 3 more formal accounts to different official bodies, and in each case, she gave the same account with the same precision and the same specific details. Because a true thing is always the same story told the same way, and she had learned the hard way to distinguish between those who appreciated this consistency and those who were waiting for an inconsistency to use. The people she encountered in the official process were, in the main, doing their jobs with care, not with urgency. The system had its own pace, and she had to accept the system's pace, the same way she had accepted the compound's pace for 8 months, and worked within it, rather than against it. Her father came to 2 of the formal sessions. He sat in the corridor outside the rooms and waited, and when she came out he was always there, hands in his coat pockets, looking at the floor until she came through the door, and then looking at her with the expression of a person who is trying to learn something about themselves from the face of the person they have harmed, and who has not yet found the complete answer. She did not give him the complete answer. It was not hers to give. It was something he was going to have to find himself, at his own pace, in his own time. What she gave him was the truth when he asked for it, and silence when he didn't, and the specific kind of patience that comes not from forgiving someone quickly and getting past it, but from understanding that a relationship is a long piece of ground, not a single moment, and that the single moment where everything went wrong is not the ground's whole story. Gerald Calloway had been given bad information and had acted on it badly, and had rationalized it, and had lived inside the rationalization for 8 months. This was not the same as malice. She knew this. She also knew that knowing it did not erase the 8 months, or the 4 sheets of paper, or the nights she had counted candles alone in her mind. Both things were real. She held both things and did not collapse either one. They drove home together on a Thursday evening, after a session that had run long, and the car was warm, and neither of them spoke for the first 30 minutes. And then her father said, without looking away from the road, "Your mother called me." Nora looked at him. "What?" 2 weeks ago, she saw something in the local paper, about the Circle investigation. He paused. "She asked about you." Nora was quiet. Her mother. Dennis with the pool. The car that had driven past the compound 6 years ago and had not slowed down, and the silence in the car afterward that Nora had not known how to read. "What did you tell her?" Nora said. "That you were out, that you were doing what needed to be done, that you were yourself." He said the last part with a care that told her he had thought about those words specifically. "She said to tell you she wanted to talk if you were willing." Nora looked out the window. The evening roads, the county she had grown up in, the fields and fences, and the ordinary county dark of a Thursday in November. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. He drove. She thought about it, and kept thinking, and did not arrive at an answer that night, or the next week, or for several months after that. The answer, when it came, was not clean, but it was honest, and she had learned by then that honest was worth more than clean, and that you could live in the honest version of things indefinitely, which was something you could not say about the clean version. She thought about all of this for a long time, and then she stopped thinking and watched the road. 4 years after she walked out of the gate, Nora Calloway sat at a table in a community center meeting room in a mid-sized city, 2 hours from the county where she had grown up, and she watched 12 people walk through the door. They came in ones and twos, with the careful movements of people who are not yet sure they belong in the room they have entered. Some of them looked at the floor. Some of them looked at the walls. One woman came in and went straight to the coffee station and stood with her back to the room for a moment before turning around. And Nora recognized this. The need for a task. A reason to occupy the body while the mind caught up. She had created this meeting. She had been creating them, in different locations and different formats, for 2 years. This one was for people who had left residential communities of the kind she had been a part of, communities organized around a central authority, with closed information systems, with managed relationships to the outside world, with the particular kind of teaching that uses true things to lead toward controlled conclusions. There were more of these communities than most people assumed. They were not all the same, but the experience of leaving them shared enough common features that a room like this one, with 12 people and bad coffee and metal folding chairs, could hold 12 different histories and have them recognize one another. She was 22 now. She was not the same person who had counted candles in the East Wing, and she was also entirely that person. The counting had not stopped. She counted things differently now. She counted the number of people who came to meetings, the number of family contact letters she had helped draft for people trying to reconnect with the communities that officials had been able to verify and intervene with, the number of calls she had fielded from Barbara's successor, a man named Harold who handled community concern cases for the county authority, and who called her 3 or 4 times a year, because she had become, without planning it, the person who understood the specific texture of these situations well enough to be genuinely useful to people whose professional training had not given them access to the interior of them. She had thought, when she was 18, that what she needed to do with the vault's contents was use them to address a specific situation at a specific compound. She had done that. The investigation into the Circle of the Faithful had moved through its official process over the course of 14 months. Elder Graves had not been imprisoned, because the legal ground was complicated. The arrangements were documented, but their illegality was a matter of civil rather than criminal law in most instances, and the structures that would have allowed criminal prosecution were not clearly applicable to everything that had happened. This had been one of the hard lessons of the aftermath. The machinery of justice moved on rails that did not always reach the places where the damage had been done. What had happened instead was this: the Circle's operation was formally reviewed. 11 people who were identified in the arrangement documents as having been brought to the compound through financial transactions involving family members were given the documentation, official support, and the right of exit with assistance. Not all of them left. Some of them chose to remain, and this was another hard lesson. People who have been inside a system long enough sometimes find that their real life is the system, and removing the structure without replacing it with something is not liberation, but a different kind of loss. Nora had learned to hold this without anger and without resignation, because the right of choice is not the same as a guaranteed outcome of that choice. Bet had left. She had gone to her mother, and Nora knew from a letter she received 8 months after leaving that the reunion was complicated, which was the word Bet used, and that the process of revising the story she had been given, restoring the nuance, the complexity, the real person in place of the category, was ongoing and not finished, and possibly not the kind of thing that gets finished. But Bet was out. She was working. She was seeing her mother twice a month, and she had written to Nora to say that her mother was, it turned out, also complicated, which is not the same as being bad, and that Bet was learning to tell the difference. Cora had not left. Cora had been given the documentation, and the support, and the right of exit, and had chosen to remain with a smaller group of people from the Circle, who had formed a new and more loosely organized community. Nora thought about Cora sometimes. She thought about the peace in Cora's face, the peace that had come from putting down the complexity, and she thought about whether a person who has put something down and found relief is ever truly a victim of that relief, or whether that question is too clean for the reality it describes. She did not arrive at a clean answer. She stopped needing to. Helen had left. This was the outcome Nora had allowed herself to hope for, but had not counted on. Helen had walked out of the compound during the period of official review, quietly, the way she had done everything for 11 years, without announcement, without drama. She had contacted Nora 6 months after leaving. She had moved to a house in the northern part of the county and planted a real garden. The letter she sent described the soil as much better than the East Wing patch. She said the things she grew were still small. She said it was better to grow small things in good soil than to not grow things at all. Warren had given his full account to the investigation. He had not been prosecuted for anything, because he was as much a product of the system as anyone else, and his cooperation had been genuine and useful. He had left the county. Nora did not know where he was. She thought about him occasionally and hoped, without knowing why, that he had found something to do with the precision of his mind that did not require the performance of certainty. Petra had gone back to her sister. This was the outcome Nora thought about most, not because it was the most dramatic, but because it was the most ordinary, and ordinary was what had been stolen. Petra and her sister, whose name was Annette, had spent a weekend together, within 3 weeks of Petra's departure from the compound. Nora did not know what that weekend looked like. She imagined it sometimes. She imagined the particular quality of a reunion between two people who have been held apart long enough that they have both changed, and who have to meet each other's changed versions before they can get back to the real thing, and who do it anyway. She imagined it as slow and awkward and real. She imagined it as a room with no performance in it. She and her father had spent 2 years slowly restoring their relationship, which was a word neither of them would have used, and which was accurate anyway. Gerald Calloway had given a formal account to the investigation. He had also, in private conversations with Nora across those 2 years, given a different kind of account, one that was not formal and that did not serve any official purpose but that was necessary anyway. The kind of accounting you do between two people who have been on the wrong sides of a thing and need to establish, for each other, what each of them actually knew and when. He had not known. This had taken Nora longer to fully believe than she wanted to admit, because believing it required sitting with the harder version of events, which was that the system had deceived them both simultaneously, that they had been separated from each other by a management technique rather than by a fundamental failure of love, and that the management technique was so practiced that neither of them had seen it while it was happening. She believed it now. She had believed it for about 1.5 years. Gerald had not rebuilt the hardware business. He had found steady work with a county maintenance contractor, which was less than what he had imagined for himself and enough to live on, and the 2 debts were cleared, and he was not borrowing, and the house was not tilting. He had begun, tentatively, attending a small community church in town, a real one, with a structure loose enough to be left when you wanted to leave, with no one tracking your contact with the outside world. He had told Nora about this with a caution that she recognized as him waiting to see if she would tell him it was a mistake. She had not told him that. She had told him that a community that did not manage the exits was a community worth trying. He had said that was exactly it. That was exactly the thing. She had not rebuilt herself, because she was not broken. This was the distinction she returned to most often in the work she now did. The meetings she facilitated, the calls she received from Harold and from families, and from people 2 weeks or 2 years or 10 years out of situations like the one she had been in. She was not a person who had been broken by what happened to her and who had since repaired. She was a person who had been put into a place that was designed to change her into something it found more useful, and who had not been changed in that direction, and who carried, in the specific gravity of that resistance, both the cost of it and the use of it. The cost. She was not always easy to be with. She watched people carefully, and this could read as distance. She did not trust quickly, which was accurate and appropriate, and sometimes lonely. She had spent 18 months processing, with a therapist named Diane who worked specifically with people from closed communities, the various ways the compound's techniques had done more work than she had realized while they were happening, the seams she had not fully noticed, the edges that had been more affected than she had known. She had done this work without drama, and without the particular pride of having survived something intact, because intact was not the right word, and drama would have been dishonest. The use, she was here, in this room, with 12 people who had walked in with careful movements, and who were beginning, slowly, to look at each other. She did not run these meetings as a teacher. She had been very deliberate about this from the beginning, because the people in the room had spent enough time inside a structure where someone at the front of the room shaped the meaning of everything that followed. She ran them as a participant, with more experience, which was different. She asked questions, and let the questions stay open. She described her own experience in specific terms, and without conclusions. She offered what she had learned, not as the thing they should take away, but as the thing one person took away from one experience, and she trusted the room to do something with that, or to do nothing with it, and she was equally interested in both outcomes. She had kept the 4 sheets of paper. They were in a file in the office of the county authority, where they had been since she handed them to Ellen. She had copies, in a folder at her apartment. She looked at them sometimes, not often. The handwriting was small and tight, and covered every available space on the page, and when she read it, she could feel the specific pressure of the time she had been writing in. The cold metal room, the lamp on the desk, the 25 minutes. She could feel the particular quality of that attention. She did not sentimentalize it. But she did not want to lose it either, because it was evidence not just of what the compound had done, but of what she had been able to do inside it, and those two things lived on the same 4 sheets of paper. Tonight, in the meeting room, a man on the far side of the circle spoke first. He was perhaps 30, with the kind of quiet that comes from a long habit of measuring words before spending them. He said his name was Alan, and that he had been out for 3 months, and that the hardest thing for him was the sound of his own voice when he said things that used to be forbidden. The things themselves were ordinary, the words were simple, but he said the sound of his own voice saying them was still, 3 months out, strange to him. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the woman who had gone to the coffee station said that she understood that, and her name was Rose, and she had been out for 11 months, and she said the voice thing was real, and it did get less strange, but you had to practice it. You had to actually spend time saying things that were yours to say, not because someone told you to say them, and not because they served a purpose inside a structure. Alan nodded. The room moved, not quickly, not with any single dramatic moment. It moved the way rooms with 12 careful people in them move, when the people begin to trust the room a little more than they trusted it when they walked in, unevenly, with stops and starts, with the occasional silence that was not empty but was working. Nora listened. She contributed twice, concisely, in the way she had learned was most useful, specific enough to be real, short enough to leave space. She watched Alan's shoulders drop, slightly, over the course of the meeting. She watched Rose lean forward in her chair, and then further forward, as the conversation found its level. She thought, briefly, about the word on the gathering room wall, alignment. She thought about how the compound had used it to mean agreement, sameness, the erasure of deviation. She thought about how she used it now, privately, in the accounting she kept for herself. Alignment as the thing that happens when what you know, and what you do, and what you say, move in the same direction. Not because someone has engineered them to, but because the engineering is yours, built from what you actually understand to be true. She was aligned, imperfectly, in the way that real things are imperfect, but entirely hers. After the meeting, she stayed to stack chairs. Alan helped without being asked. They worked in the particular companionable silence of people doing a shared physical task after a long conversation, and when the last chair was on the stack, he said, without looking at her, that this had been useful and he was going to come back next month. She said she was glad. She meant it in the whole way that you mean things when you are no longer performing any version of them. She drove home in the dark. She had an apartment now, a small one, on the 3rd floor of a building, with a window that faced east. She had a cactus on the windowsill that she had bought for $11 at a gas station 2 years ago, as a joke with herself about what it meant to grow things in difficult conditions. The cactus had grown. It was larger than she had expected. It had, recently, produced a single small yellow flower that she had looked at for several mornings in a row, not because it was exceptional, but because it was there, in her window, in her apartment, in her particular life. And everything in her particular life was exactly and entirely hers. She unlocked the door. She went inside. She turned on the light. She thought about the vault, not the room with the filing cabinets, but the other vault, the one that lived in her, the one that had been built not by Elder Graves but by every day she had spent inside his system, paying close enough attention to understand each thing it did. She carried that vault the way a physician carries the knowledge of how things go wrong, not to use against people, but to recognize the signs early, to call the right name, to put the right information in the hands of someone who needed it. She thought about what Helen had said in the candle corridor, about the garden, the small things in poor soil, the private patch of ground that was hers, because she was the one who decided to plant in it, with no one telling her to, and no one knowing it mattered. She had her garden. It was not made of soil. She sat at her table. She opened her notebook. She began writing down what she remembered from the meeting, specific things that Alan and Rose and the others had said, the particular language, the particular moments, not because she would use their words, but because she had learned, early and completely, that paying attention to the real and specific things people say is the most fundamental form of respect you can offer to another person's experience. She wrote until her hand was tired. Then she put down the pen. She went to the window. The cactus was there, with its flower. The city was there, with its lights. The night was clear. She stood there for a moment in the quiet. She was not counting anything. She was just there. In her body, in her apartment, in her life. Present to all of it. Not aligned to it by someone else's design. Not performing anything for anyone. Just herself, in the simplest and most complete sense of the word. She turned off the light and went to bed, and outside the city went on doing what cities do, and the flower on the cactus stayed small and yellow in the dark, and the night moved toward morning the way it always does, without asking, and completely, and without stopping.